Sometimes the cruelest wounds are the ones we watch happen to others and do nothing about. Sometimes silence becomes our greatest regret. In the summer of 1873, a young woman came to Silver Ridge and was treated like she was worth nothing. The widow called her a slave. The town believed it. For 6 months she scrubbed floors and took every insult without fighting back. But a mountain man named Caleb Stone was watching. He saw something nobody else did. When a letter with a gold seal fell from her apron, everything changed. That letter held a secret that would turn the whole town upside down. What was in that letter? Before we go on, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. Silver Ridge sat in a valley where the mountains met the high desert. A town that had grown from a mining camp into something more permanent. The silver had mostly played out by 1873, but enough wealth remained in the hands of a few families to keep the town alive. Main Street ran straight as a rifle shot through the center of town, lined with false-fronted buildings that tried to look more substantial than they were. The general store, the saloon, the land office, the church with its white steeple, all the usual marks of civilization pushing west. But Silver Ridge had something else, something that set it apart from other frontier towns struggling to find their footing. It had Eleanor Hartwell. She ruled the town the way some women rule a parlor, with careful attention to who sat where and who spoke when. But Eleanor's dominion extended far beyond social niceties. She owned the largest ranch in the territory, controlled the water rights to 3 crucial streams, and held mortgages on half the businesses in town. When Eleanor Hartwell walked down Main Street, men tipped their hats and women nodded with careful respect. Not because they loved her, because they feared what she could take away. Eleanor was a handsome woman in her early 50s, tall and straight-backed, with silver threading through dark hair she wore in an elaborate coil. She dressed in the finest fabrics that could be ordered from San Francisco, always in deep colors, burgundy, forest green, midnight blue, that spoke of wealth and authority. She carried a mahogany cane with a silver handle, not because she needed it for walking, but because it made a satisfying sound on the boardwalk when she wanted someone's attention. That cane had become as much a symbol of her power as the Hartwell brand on cattle. The Hartwell estate sat 2 miles outside town, a sprawling ranch house built of stone and timber that Thomas Hartwell had constructed over 20 years. Thomas had been a different sort of man than his widow. Folks remembered him as fair-minded and generous, quick to help a neighbor and slow to take offense. He'd built his fortune through hard work and honest dealing, and he'd been respected in a way that Eleanor never would be. When Thomas died suddenly 6 months back, there'd been genuine grief in Silver Ridge. When Eleanor took over the ranch and everything Thomas had built, there'd been something else, a sense of unease that no one quite wanted to name. The ranch house reflected Thomas's character more than Eleanor's. It was solid and well built, designed for comfort rather than show. Wide porches wrapped around 3 sides, offering shade in summer and protection from winter wind. The main room had a stone fireplace large enough to roast a whole pig, and the furniture was heavy and practical. But Eleanor had been making changes. She'd ordered new wallpaper from back east, replaced the simple curtains with velvet drapes, and filled the rooms with delicate furniture that looked like it might break if you sat too hard. The ranch employed a dozen hands who worked the cattle and maintained the property. There was also a small staff that kept the house, a cook, a housekeeper, and the girl, Sarah. No one in Silver Ridge knew her last name. Eleanor simply called her the girl, or my maid, when she bothered to acknowledge her at all. Most of the time, Eleanor referred to her in the third person, even when Sarah stood right there in the room. "Tell the girl to fetch my shawl. Has the girl finished the washing? See that the girl doesn't burn dinner." Sarah had appeared at the Hartwell ranch shortly before Thomas died. One day she wasn't there, and the next day she was. A quiet young woman with dark hair and grey eyes who moved through the house like a shadow. She looked to be in her early 20s, though it was hard to tell. She wore plain grey dresses that hung loose on her slender frame, and she kept her hair pulled back in a severe bun that did nothing to flatter her features. Her hands were calloused from work, her skin weathered despite her youth, but there was something about her that didn't quite fit. Something in the way she moved, perhaps, or the way she held herself even when scrubbing floors. She had a quietness that seemed different from the beaten-down silence of someone truly broken. When she thought no one was watching, her eyes held a distant look, as if she were somewhere far away from Silver Ridge and the Hartwell Ranch. Eleanor treated her with casual cruelty that grew worse after Thomas's death. She piled extra work on Sarah's shoulders, criticized everything she did, and spoke to her with contempt that made the other servants uncomfortable. The cook, a Mexican woman named Rosa, who'd worked for Thomas for 15 years, tried to slip Sarah extra food when Eleanor wasn't looking. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, sometimes helped Sarah with the heavier tasks. But neither woman dared speak against Eleanor's treatment. They had families to feed and no other prospects in Silver Ridge. The town whispered about Sarah, of course. Some said she was a distant relation Eleanor had taken in out of charity. Others claimed she was an orphan from back east, sent west as part of some church program. A few darkly suggested she was something worse, a kept woman, perhaps, or someone with a shameful past that Eleanor held over her head. But no one knew for certain, and no one dared ask Eleanor directly. Caleb Stone had been working the Hartwell Ranch for 3 months when summer arrived. He was a mountain man by trade and temperament, someone who preferred the company of pine trees and elk to people and their complications. He'd come down from his traplines in the high country because he needed ready money to restock his supplies before winter. Thomas Hartwell had offered him work maintaining the property's outer boundaries, mending fences, clearing deadfall, keeping the line shacks in repair. It was solitary work that suited Caleb fine. He was a man in his late 30s, weathered by sun and wind and hard living, tall and lean, with dark hair that hung to his shoulders and a beard he kept trimmed close. His eyes were the pale blue of a winter sky, sharp and careful, missing nothing. He wore buckskin and wool, clothes meant for utility rather than appearance, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd survived things that would kill softer men. He'd been a cavalry scout during the war, though he didn't talk about those years. After Appomattox, he'd headed west and up into the mountains, looking for something he couldn't quite name. Peace, maybe, or just distance from what he'd seen and done. Caleb had known Thomas Hartwell slightly, enough to respect the man. When Thomas offered him work, Caleb had accepted because the pay was fair, and Thomas didn't ask questions about a man's past. They'd shared a few conversations about the mountains and the land, both men appreciating that the other understood the value of silence. Thomas's sudden death had troubled Caleb. The man had seemed healthy enough, and his passing came without warning. One day, Thomas was riding his property line, checking on his herds. 3 days later, he was dead, taken by what the doctor called a stomach ailment. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the ranch. With half the territory turning out for the funeral, Eleanor had worn black silk and shed appropriate tears. But Caleb had watched her at the graveside and seen something that bothered him. She'd looked impatient, as if the funeral were an inconvenience keeping her from more important matters. And when the last mourner had left, she'd walked back to the ranch house without a single glance at her husband's grave. Caleb had considered moving on after Thomas died. He didn't much care for Eleanor Hartwell, and the thought of working for her didn't sit well. But something made him stay. Maybe it was loyalty to Thomas's memory. Maybe it was the good pay that would see him through another winter. Or maybe it was something else, something he hadn't quite admitted to himself yet. He'd first noticed Sarah a few days after Thomas's funeral. He'd come in from the range to get a new axe handle from the tool shed, and he'd seen her hanging laundry in the yard behind the main house. Eleanor had been standing on the back porch, her mahogany cane tapping against the railing as she criticized every sheet Sarah pinned to the line. Too much water wrung out, not enough. Crooked on the line, careless with the pins. Sarah had worked steadily through the criticism, her face expressionless, her movements careful and precise. But Caleb had seen her hands trembling slightly as she reached for another clothespin. And when Eleanor had finally gone back inside, Sarah had stood very still for a long moment, her head bowed, her shoulders tight with tension she couldn't release. That was when Caleb had first wondered who she really was. Because the way she stood there in the yard, the way she gathered herself before returning to work, that wasn't the posture of a servant accepting her lot. That was someone enduring something they knew was wrong, waiting for something to change. Over the following weeks, Caleb found himself watching Sarah more often than he should have. Not in any improper way, but with the same careful attention he'd give to a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. He noticed things. The way she moved through the house with efficiency that spoke of education and refinement, not servitude. The way she sometimes paused at the ranch library door, looking at the books with an expression of longing that suggested she could read them, and read them well. The way she spoke to the horses in the barn, her voice gentle and cultured, using words no common servant would know, and he noticed how Eleanor treated her. The casual slaps across the face for imagined infractions, the public humiliations in front of the other staff, the way Eleanor seemed to take genuine pleasure in Sarah's degradation, as if grinding her down was some kind of personal victory. It gnawed at Caleb. He'd seen cruelty before, in war, on the frontier, in all the places where civilized rules wore thin. But there was something particularly ugly about Eleanor's treatment of Sarah. It had a personal quality to it. A specific malice that went beyond how a harsh mistress might treat an incompetent servant. One evening in late June, Caleb had been working late, mending a corral fence, when he'd heard voices coming from the barn. He'd walked over quietly. Old scouting habits died hard, and stopped in the shadows when he realized Sarah was inside, talking to one of the horses. "There now." "Steady," she'd been saying, her voice low and soothing. "I know it hurts, but we'll get that stone out and you'll feel better." She'd been bent over the horse's hoof, working carefully to remove a lodged pebble that had made the animal lame. Father always said a good horseman takes care of his animals first, and himself second. He was right about that, at least, Father. The word had caught Caleb's attention. The way she said it carried weight, affection, and loss. This was no orphan with no family. This was someone's daughter, someone who'd been raised with care and love. Then Eleanor's voice had cut through the evening air like a whip crack. "What are you doing in here, girl?" "I sent you to prepare my bath an hour ago." Sarah had straightened quickly, the horse's hoof dropping back to the straw-covered floor. "I'm sorry, ma'am. The gelding was lame. I thought, you're not paid to think." Eleanor had stepped into the barn, her cane clicking against the wooden floor. "You're paid to do as you're told. Nothing more." "Yes, ma'am." Sarah's voice had gone flat. "Empty, look at me when I speak to you." Sarah had lifted her eyes, and even from where Caleb stood in the shadows, he'd seen the careful blankness in her expression. Not submission, control. The kind of control that came from knowing that showing your true feelings would only make things worse. Eleanor had studied her for a long moment, then smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "Your hands are filthy. Wash them before you touch anything in my house. And if my bath isn't ready in 10 minutes, you'll go without supper, again." "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor had left, and Sarah had stood there in the barn for several heartbeats, her dirty hands clenched at her sides, her breathing slow and deliberate. Then she'd bent back to the horse, finished removing the stone quickly and competently, and walked out of the barn with her head high. Caleb had stepped out of the shadows after she'd gone, looking at the horse she'd tended. The animal was one of Thomas's favorites, a good gelding with years of work left in him. Someone who knew horses had cared for him properly. Someone who'd been taught well. That was the night Caleb decided he couldn't simply ignore what was happening at the Hartwell Ranch. Whatever Sarah's story was, whatever had brought her here and put her at Eleanor's mercy, it wasn't right. Thomas Hartwell wouldn't have stood for it. And Caleb found he couldn't either. He didn't know yet what he could do about it. He was just a hired hand, working another man's, another woman's land. He had no authority, no standing, no right to interfere in Eleanor Hartwell's business. But he'd spent too many years of his life looking away from things that troubled him, doing what he was told without question, following orders that led to suffering he couldn't prevent. He was older now, free of military command and civilian law in ways he hadn't been before. And if there was one advantage to living rough in the mountains, with only your conscience for company, it was that you learned to listen to what that conscience had to say. His conscience was telling him that something was very wrong at the Hartwell Ranch, and that the quiet young woman with grey eyes and calloused hands was at the center of it. Caleb stood in the barn doorway that evening, watching the sun sink behind the western mountains, and made himself a promise. He would find out who Sarah really was. He would learn what hold Eleanor had over her. And if it was in his power to do something about it, he would. Some things, he'd learned, were worth the risk, worth the cost, worth standing up for even when staying silent would be easier. This, he suspected, was going to be one of those things. The first Saturday in July dawned hot and cloudless, the kind of day that made the mountains shimmer in the distance and turn Main Street into a river of dust. It was market day in Silver Ridge, when ranch families came to town for supplies and the boardwalks filled with people conducting the week's business. Caleb had ridden in with a list from the ranch foreman, nails, rope, lamp oil, and a new file for the farrier's tools. He'd planned to complete his errands quickly and head back to the high country line shack where he'd been working all week, but Eleanor Hartwell had other plans. She arrived in town mid-morning, in her black carriage, driven by Dutch, her foreman. Dutch was a thick-shouldered man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that held no warmth. He'd come to work at the Hartwell Ranch a month after Thomas died, hired on by Eleanor from somewhere back east. The other ranch hands didn't much care for him. He had a cruel streak that showed itself in how he treated the horses and anyone he considered beneath him. Sarah sat in the carriage beside Eleanor, dressed in the same grey dress she always wore, her hands folded in her lap. Caleb watched from outside the general store as Dutch pulled the carriage to a stop in front of the dressmaker's shop. Eleanor stepped down first, ignoring the hand Dutch offered, and turned to Sarah with a sharp gesture. "Bring the parcels inside when I call for them. And wait by the carriage. I don't want you wandering off and embarrassing me." "Yes." "Ma'am?" Sarah's voice was barely audible over the street noise. Eleanor swept into the dressmaker's shop, her cane tapping an imperious rhythm. Dutch tied the horses and followed her inside, leaving Sarah alone beside the carriage. She stood in the full sun, no parasol, no shade, her hands still clasped in front of her. Caleb could see a sheen of perspiration on her forehead, but she didn't move or complain. He finished his business at the general store, loaded his supplies onto his horse, and found himself walking toward the carriage. He told himself he was just checking on the horses, making sure they had water in this heat. But that wasn't entirely true, and he knew it. "Morning," he said quietly as he approached. Sarah's eyes flicked toward him, then away. "Good morning, Mr. Stone," so she knew his name. He found that interesting, though he supposed all the ranch employees knew each other by sight, if not by acquaintance. "Hot day to be standing in the sun." "I'm fine. There's shade over by the livery if you wanted to wait there." "Mrs. Hartwell told me to wait here." Caleb glanced at the dressmaker's shop. Through the window he could see Eleanor examining bolts of fabric, while the dressmaker hovered nervously nearby. "She'll be in there a while yet. Place your hand on the carriage wheel. If she looks out, she'll see you right where you're supposed to be." Sarah's lips twitched, almost a smile. "You're suggesting I be disobedient. I'm suggesting you not get heat stroke for no good reason." For a moment he thought she might actually take his advice. But then her expression closed off again, and she shook her head slightly. "Thank you, but no. It's easier to just do as she says. Easier." The word bothered him more than it should have, because Sarah didn't look like someone who'd chosen the easy path. She looked like someone who'd run out of other options. Before Caleb could respond, a commotion broke out across the street. 2 dogs had gotten into a fight outside the saloon, and a crowd gathered to watch. In the chaos, someone's wagon backed up suddenly, and the driver lost control. The wagon careened across the street, heading straight for Eleanor's carriage. Caleb moved without thinking. He grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her clear, just as the runaway wagon clipped the carriage, sending it rocking on its wheels. The horses reared and whinnied, their eyes rolling white with fear. Sarah stumbled against Caleb, and he steadied her, his hands on her shoulders. She was breathing hard, her face pale. But what struck him was the way she looked at him in that unguarded moment. With surprise, yes, but also with something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. As if no one had protected her from anything in a very long time, and she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone on her side. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, stepping back from his grip. "Thank you. What is going on out here?" Eleanor's voice cut through the noise like a blade. She'd emerged from the dressmaker's shop, Dutch right behind her. Her eyes took in the scene in an instant. The wagon, the spooked horses, Sarah standing close to Caleb with his hands still hovering near her shoulders. "Mrs. Hartwell," Caleb said evenly. "There was an accident. The girl was nearly hit. The girl has a name," Eleanor said coldly. Then to Sarah, "Come here, now." Sarah moved immediately, crossing to Eleanor's side. The brief moment of connection between her and Caleb might never have happened. She was all obedience again, all careful blankness. Eleanor looked her up and down, then turned that sharp gaze on Caleb. "I don't recall asking you to involve yourself in my affairs. Mr. Stone, wasn't much involving needed. Just happened to be standing right there when things went sideways. How fortunate." Eleanor's tone suggested she found it anything but fortunate. She raised her cane and pointed it at Sarah. "You were supposed to be watching the parcels. Instead, you're out here creating scenes with the hired help." "Ma'am, I didn't," Sarah began. The crack of Eleanor's hand across Sarah's face silenced her. It happened so fast that the gathered crowd barely had time to register what they'd seen. But Caleb saw it, saw the way Sarah's head snapped to the side, saw the red mark blooming on her cheek, saw the way she didn't raise a hand to touch the injury, didn't make a sound, just stood there taking it like she'd taken 100 such blows before. Something cold and hard settled in Caleb's chest. He'd seen violence aplenty in his years, more than any man should have to see. But there was something about watching a defenseless person struck in broad daylight, in front of witnesses who did nothing, that made his hands curl into fists at his sides. "You will not embarrass me in public," Eleanor said to Sarah, her voice pitched low enough that only those nearby could hear. "You will remember your place. You will remember what you are, property, that's all. Do you understand?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." Eleanor turned to Dutch. "Get the parcels from inside. We're leaving." This town has become entirely too unruly for civilized people. As Dutch moved to comply, Eleanor's gaze landed on Caleb again. "Mr. Stone, you seem to have a great deal of interest in matters that don't concern you. I wonder if perhaps you've forgotten your own place. You work for me. You do the job you're paid for and nothing more. If that arrangement no longer suits you, I'm certain I can find another mountain man willing to mend fences for good wages." It was a threat, pure and simple. Keep your mouth shut and your eyes down, or find yourself without employment. In another time, with another woman, Caleb might have backed down. He'd walked away from plenty of fights that weren't his to begin with. But something about this moment, about the red mark on Sarah's face and the way Eleanor stood there radiating cruel satisfaction, made him dig in his heels. "I understand the arrangement just fine, Mrs. Hartwell," he said quietly. "I work your land and fix what needs fixing. But I can't help what I see. And I got to say, what I see troubles me some." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Your troubles are not my concern." "No, ma'am." "I suspect they're not." For a long moment they stood there, measuring each other. Eleanor Hartwell, with all her wealth and power and social standing. Caleb Stone with nothing but his conscience and a reputation for being too stubborn for his own good. The crowd around them had gone quiet, sensing that something significant was happening, but not quite understanding what. Finally, Eleanor smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You strike me as a man who knows when he's outmatched, Mr. Stone. I suggest you remember that wisdom in the coming days. The mountains can be dangerous for those who don't know when to mind their own business." She climbed into the carriage, followed by Sarah. Dutch loaded the parcels and took his place on the driver's seat. As the carriage pulled away, Sarah looked back once through the small rear window. Her eyes met Caleb's for just an instant, and in that glance he saw something that made his earlier suspicions crystallize into certainty. She wasn't afraid. She was angry. Deeply, carefully angry, in the way that only comes from enduring long injustice with no means to fight back. Whatever Sarah was, whatever had brought her to the Hartwell Ranch and put her at Eleanor's mercy, she wasn't broken. She was waiting, biding her time. The question was, waiting for what? Caleb stood in the dusty street, long after the carriage disappeared, his mind turning over everything he'd seen and heard. The townspeople around him had already begun to disperse, returning to their business as if nothing had happened. That bothered him almost as much as the slap itself. All these decent folks, and not one of them had stepped forward. Not one of them had said a word. "That was a brave thing you did," a voice said behind him. Or a foolish one. Sometimes hard to tell the difference. Caleb turned to find Doc Hayes standing there, a grizzled man in his 60s with kind eyes and steady hands. He'd been the town doctor for 30 years, delivered most of the children, who now ran up and down Main Street, and patched up more bullet wounds and broken bones than he probably cared to remember. Didn't feel brave, Caleb said. Felt necessary. Those two things often go together. Doc Hayes adjusted his spectacles, looking down the street where the carriage had gone. I treated Thomas in his final days. He was a good man. Didn't deserve to go the way he did. The way he did? Caleb's attention sharpened. Thought it was a stomach ailment. That's what I put on the death certificate. Doc Hayes met his eyes. But stomach ailments don't usually present the way Thomas's did. The symptoms he showed, the vomiting, the tremors, the pain, they were consistent with something else. Poison, Caleb said flatly. Doc Hayes didn't confirm or deny. He just looked tired. I'm an old man, Mr. Stone. I have a practice to maintain and people who depend on me. I can't go making accusations I can't prove against the richest woman in the territory. Even if my conscience tells me I should. What about the girl? Caleb asked. Sarah, you know anything about her? Only that she appeared around the time Thomas took ill. Eleanor claimed she was a distant relation she was helping out. But I saw how Thomas looked at her the one time I visited while she was in the room. It wasn't the way a man looks at a charity case. It was the way a man looks at... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. At someone he'd been waiting a long time to see. The pieces were starting to fit together in Caleb's mind, forming a picture that made him angry and sad in equal measure. Does anyone else know what you're telling me? If they do, they're not saying. Eleanor Hartwell holds too many people's futures in her hands. Speak against her, and you might find yourself without credit at the bank, or your mortgage called in, or your business mysteriously struggling. She's made it clear what happens to those who cross her. Doc Hayes put a hand on Caleb's shoulder. You seem like a decent man, and I'm glad someone finally stood up to her, even in a small way. But be careful. Eleanor doesn't forgive and she doesn't forget. And she has resources you don't. I appreciate the warning, Doc. One more thing. The old doctor's voice dropped even lower. Thomas had a safety deposit box at the bank. Right before he died, he told me he'd updated his will and put certain documents where they'd be safe. He said if anything happened to him, I should make sure those documents saw daylight. But when I went to the bank after the funeral, Eleanor had already cleaned out the box. Said it was her right as his widow. The bank manager didn't argue. What was in the will? The original one? I don't know. Thomas never told me specifics, but he seemed relieved when he'd finished with the lawyer. Said he'd finally made things right, and that justice would be served even if he wasn't around to see it. Doc Hayes shook his head. 2 days later he was dead, and Eleanor was burning papers in the fireplace. I saw the smoke from the road when I rode out to check on him. Caleb stood quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then he held out his hand. Thank you for trusting me with this, Doc. The older man shook his hand firmly. I'm trusting you because you're the first person I've seen who looks willing to do something about it. Just remember, doing the right thing and surviving the right thing are two different challenges. Try to manage both if you can. After Doc Hayes left, Caleb walked to the edge of town, where he'd tied his horse. He loaded his supplies mechanically, his mind elsewhere. The confrontation with Eleanor had changed something fundamental. He'd declared himself, however, quietly. He'd let her know that he saw what was happening and that he didn't approve. That made him a problem she'd need to deal with, but more importantly, he'd seen that brief flash in Sarah's eyes. That anger, that determination. She wasn't a victim waiting for rescue. She was someone with her own plan, her own purpose. He didn't know what it was yet, but he intended to find out. As he rode back toward the ranch, Caleb noticed a rider following him at a distance. Dutch. Eleanor was already making good on her implied threat, having him watched. Caleb didn't alter his pace or give any sign that he'd noticed. Let them watch. He hadn't done anything wrong, and he didn't plan to. But he also didn't plan to look away anymore. When he reached the ranch, he found the foreman waiting by the barn. The man looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Mrs. Hartwell wants to see you," the foreman said. "In the study, now," she said right away. Caleb dismounted and handed over his horse's reins. "Take care of him for me, will you? He's had a long day." The walk to the main house felt longer than it should have. Dutch had already returned and stood on the porch, his arms crossed, a smirk on his face that said he knew something Caleb didn't, or thought he did. Eleanor was waiting in Thomas's old study, standing behind the desk like she owned not just the room but everything in it, which legally she probably did. The study was lined with books Thomas had collected over the years, histories, agricultural manuals, poetry, philosophy. Eleanor had changed nothing in here except to add her own presence, which somehow made the room feel smaller and colder. "Mr. Stone," she said without preamble, "I've been reviewing the ranch accounts and considering the workforce I currently employ. I've come to realize that I'm overstaffed for the winter months ahead. I'll need to make some difficult decisions about who stays on and who seeks employment elsewhere." It was a carefully worded threat. She wasn't firing him outright. That would look petty and vindictive. But she was letting him know his position was precarious, balanced on the edge of her whim. "That's your right, Mrs. Hartwell," Caleb said evenly. "You own the place." "I do indeed." She moved around the desk, her cane tapping against the floor. "I own this ranch, this land, and every person who works here. When I give an order, I expect it to be followed without question or commentary. When I discipline my staff, I expect my employees to mind their own business. Am I making myself clear?" "Crystal clear, ma'am." "Good, because I would hate to lose a worker over something as foolish as misplaced chivalry. The girl is none of your concern. She is exactly where she belongs, doing exactly what she's meant to do. If you have a problem with how I run my household, you're welcome to seek employment elsewhere. But you will not interfere again. Not in town, not on this ranch, not anywhere. Do you understand?" Caleb met her eyes and saw the coldness there, the absolute certainty of someone who'd never been truly challenged. She believed she was untouchable. Maybe she was right, but maybe she wasn't. "I understand what you're saying, Mrs. Hartwell," he replied carefully. "Can't promise I'll agree with everything I see, but I'll do the work I'm paid for." Eleanor's expression hardened. "See that you do." Dismissed. As Caleb left the study, he passed Sarah in the hallway. She was carrying a tray of tea service toward Eleanor's sitting room, her eyes downcast, the red mark on her cheek now darkened to a bruise. She didn't look at him as he passed, but as they drew level, something fell from her apron pocket and clattered to the floor. A button, simple, made of wood. Caleb bent to pick it up, and as he rose, Sarah's hand brushed his. In that brief contact, she pressed something into his palm. Something small and folded. Then she was moving past him, murmuring "thank you" so quietly he almost missed it. He closed his fist around whatever she'd given him and kept walking, not looking back, not giving anyone watching any reason to think something had just passed between them. It wasn't until he was safely back in his small quarters near the barn that he opened his hand and unfolded the scrap of paper. It was torn from a book, the ragged edge showing where it had been carefully removed. On it, in small, precise handwriting, were 3 words, "Please help me." Below that, 3 more words, "Thomas was father." Caleb stared at the note for a long time, the pieces finally falling completely into place. Sarah wasn't a servant or a distant relation or an orphan. She was Thomas Hartwell's daughter. And somehow Eleanor had managed to trap her here, stealing her inheritance and forcing her into servitude. The question now was how, and more importantly, what Caleb was going to do about it. He looked out his window at the main house, where lights glowed warm against the gathering darkness. Somewhere in there, Sarah was going about her evening duties, playing the role of servant, waiting for someone to help her reclaim what was rightfully hers. That afternoon in town, Caleb had made a promise to himself that he'd stand up for what was right. Now he had a chance to make good on that promise. It would be dangerous. Eleanor had already shown she was willing to eliminate anyone who threatened her position, her own husband included. If Doc Hayes' suspicions were correct, but Caleb had spent too many years living in the mountains, alone with his thoughts and his regrets. He'd walked away from enough fights, looked aside from enough injustice. He'd told himself it wasn't his problem, wasn't his business, wasn't worth the risk. Not this time. He carefully folded the note and tucked it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Then he pulled out the leather work gloves that had belonged to Thomas Hartwell, the ones the foreman had given him months ago when he'd first started working the ranch. Good gloves, well made, with Thomas's initials stamped inside the cuff. Caleb had a feeling he was going to need them, because the work ahead of him wouldn't be mending fences or clearing deadfall. It would be something harder and more dangerous. It would be fighting for justice in a place where justice had been buried alongside an honest man. The note changed everything and nothing. Caleb now knew the truth, but truth without proof was just another man's opinion, in a territory where Eleanor Hartwell's money spoke louder than anyone's word. He needed evidence. He needed allies. And most importantly, he needed to be careful. Eleanor was already watching him, and one wrong move could cost him his position, or worse. For 3 days after receiving Sarah's note, Caleb went about his work with deliberate normalcy. He rode the fence lines, cleared brush from the water sources, and made repairs to the northern line shack, where snow damage from the previous winter had weakened the roof. He spoke to no one more than necessary, and gave Eleanor no reason to think he was anything other than a chastened employee who'd learned his lesson. But his mind was working constantly, turning over the problem from every angle. If Sarah was truly Thomas's daughter, there would be records, letters perhaps, legal documents, something that proved her identity and her claim to the Hartwell estate. The question was where those documents might be and how to get to them without alerting Eleanor. On the 4th day, Caleb rode into Silver Ridge on the pretext of picking up supplies for the line shack. Instead of going straight to the general store, he tied his horse outside the blacksmith shop and went inside. The blacksmith, a broad-shouldered man named Hank Morrison, had worked in Silver Ridge for 20 years. If anyone knew the town's history and its secrets, it would be Hank. The forge was hot despite the early hour, and Hank stood at the anvil, hammering a horseshoe into shape. He looked up when Caleb entered, then returned his attention to his work until the shoe was finished. Only then did he plunge it into the water barrel and turn to face his visitor. "Caleb Stone," Hank said, wiping sweat from his forehead with a rag. "Don't usually see you in town twice in 1 week. Need to ask you some questions," Caleb said. "About Thomas Hartwell." Hank's expression became guarded. "Thomas is dead? Nothing to talk about there." "There is, if you knew him well." "Did you?" "Well enough." "He was a good customer. Always paid on time, treated folks fair." Hank hung up the horseshoe to cool. "Why are you asking?" "Because something doesn't sit right with me about how things went after he died. And I'm wondering if I'm the only one who feels that way." Hank studied him for a long moment, then glanced toward the open door of the shop. The street outside was relatively quiet, but not empty. "You're working for his widow, aren't you? Seems like you'd want to keep on her good side." "There's what seems like and what is," Caleb said. "They're not always the same thing." The blacksmith seemed to make a decision. He walked to the shop door and pulled it closed, shutting out most of the street noise. When he turned back, his expression had changed. "Thomas came to see me about 2 months before he died. Had me make something special, a strong box with a good lock. Said he had important papers he needed to keep safe. Did he say what kind of papers? Didn't ask. Wasn't my business. Hank paused. But he seemed worried. Said there were people who might try to destroy certain documents if they knew they existed. Asked me not to mention the box to anyone, especially not his wife. Where's the box now? Don't know. Thomas picked it up when it was finished, paid me, and that was the last I saw of it. Hank lowered his voice. But I'll tell you something else. The day before Thomas died, a young woman came into town on the eastbound stage. I saw her get off carrying just one small bag. She asked the driver where she might find the Hartwell Ranch. I remember thinking it was odd. She was dressed plain, but she carried herself like quality folks. Had an educated way of speaking. Did you see where she went? The stage driver pointed her toward the livery, where she could hire a wagon. I was busy with work, so I didn't see what happened after that. But the next day, Thomas was sick. 3 days later, he was dead. And a week after that, I saw that same young woman working at the Hartwell Ranch, dressed in servant's clothes and looking like she'd aged 10 years. Sarah, it had to be. She'd come to Silver Ridge to see her father, and somehow Eleanor had trapped her there. Did you tell anyone else what you saw? Who would I tell? And what would I say? That I saw a woman get off a stage and then saw her again later. There's no crime in that? Hank shook his head. But I've wondered about it. Wondered if Thomas knew she was coming. Wondered what happened in that house to change things so fast. You think Eleanor had something to do with Thomas's death? I think Eleanor Hartwell is a dangerous woman who got everything she wanted the moment Thomas died. And I think asking too many questions about it is a good way to end up in trouble. Hank met Caleb's eyes. I'm telling you this because Thomas was a good man who deserved better than what he got. But I've got a family to feed and a business to run. I can't afford to make an enemy of Eleanor Hartwell. I understand, Caleb said. I appreciate you talking to me. Just be careful. You're not the first person to notice something wrong at the Hartwell place. But you might be the first one foolish enough to try doing something about it. Caleb left the blacksmith shop with more questions than answers. He knew Sarah had arrived just before Thomas died. He knew Thomas had commissioned a strong box for important documents. But he didn't know where that box was now or what it contained. If it had proof of Sarah's identity and her inheritance rights, it was probably the key to everything. His next stop was the general store, where he actually did need to pick up supplies. The shopkeeper, a thin, nervous man named Carlson, filled his order without much conversation. But as Caleb was leaving, Carlson called him back. Mr. Stone. A moment, if you would. Caleb returned to the counter. Something wrong with the order? No, the order's fine. Carlson glanced around to make sure they were alone. I couldn't help but hear what happened in town last Saturday. You standing up to Mrs. Hartwell like that. Wasn't much to it. Just reacted when that wagon came through. It was more than that, and we both know it. Carlson's voice dropped lower. My wife and I, we've been in Silver Ridge for 15 years. We knew Thomas from when he first built his ranch. He used to bring his daughter into town sometimes when she was small, before she went back east to live with her mother's family after the divorce. Caleb's attention sharpened. Thomas had a daughter, Sarah, named after her grandmother. Pretty little thing, always asking questions about everything. Smart as a whip. Thomas doted on her, but his wife, his first wife before Eleanor, wanted the girl raised with better schooling than you could get out here. They divorced when Sarah was about 7, and she went east with her mother. Thomas sent money, wrote letters, but he didn't see her much after that. It broke his heart. What happened to the mother? Died about 3 years back, I heard. Consumption. After that, Thomas tried to contact Sarah, wanted her to come out and see the ranch, maybe even stay. But Eleanor didn't like the idea. She'd married Thomas for his money and his land, and she didn't want some daughter from a previous marriage coming around with claims on the estate. The pieces were falling into place like stones dropping into water, each ripple revealing more of the picture. So when Sarah showed up, Thomas must have sent for her without telling Eleanor. Or maybe Sarah came on her own after her mother died. Either way, she arrived, and 2 days later Thomas was dead. Carlson rubbed his face with both hands. Look, I can't prove anything, but I've seen how Eleanor treats that girl. Like she's nothing, like she's property. And it makes me sick. But what can I do? Eleanor owns my mortgage. If I speak against her, I lose everything. I'm not asking you to speak against her, Caleb said. I'm just trying to understand what happened. Did Thomas say anything to you before he died? About Sarah, or about his will, or anything like that? He came in here about a week before he passed. Bought writing paper and envelopes, the good kind, with wax seals. Said he had important letters to write. He seemed, Carlson paused, searching for the word. Content. Like a man who'd made peace with something. He told me he'd been given a second chance he didn't deserve, and he intended to make the most of it. Did he mention anyone specific he was writing to? No, but I saw him post one of the letters himself at the land office. I remember because he used a gold seal on it. You don't see many of those anymore. Thomas had it made special years ago with his family crest on it, a gold seal, just like the one Sarah had mentioned in her note. Caleb felt the weight of certainty settling over him. Thomas had written to his daughter, probably explaining everything, his illness, his estate, his plans for her future. And Sarah had that letter, had kept it hidden all this time. Thank you, Mr. Carlson, Caleb said. You've been more help than you know. Carlson hesitated. If you're planning something, be careful. Eleanor has friends in high places. The territorial judge, the bank president, half the big ranchers in the territory. She's not someone you can fight head-on and win. Sometimes, Caleb said quietly. Fights aren't about winning. They're about standing up. Whether you win or not comes after. He loaded his supplies and rode back toward the ranch, his mind working through what he'd learned. Sarah was Thomas's legitimate daughter. She'd come west after her mother's death, probably at Thomas's invitation. Thomas had known he was ill, or perhaps he'd known Eleanor was poisoning him, and he'd made arrangements. The strongbox, the sealed letter, maybe even a new will hidden somewhere safe. But then Thomas had died, and Eleanor had moved quickly to secure her position. She'd destroyed any documents she could find, claimed the estate as Thomas's widow, and turned Sarah into a servant to keep her silent and powerless. It was ruthless and effective, and it would have worked perfectly if no one had bothered to look beneath the surface. Caleb knew he needed to find that strongbox. But where would Thomas have hidden it? Not in the main house. Eleanor would have found it there. Not in the bank, because she'd already cleaned out the safety deposit box. Somewhere else, somewhere only Thomas would think of, somewhere he trusted, the line shacks. Thomas had built 3 of them on the far reaches of the property, places where ranch hands could shelter during long rides or bad weather. They were simple structures, but solid. Thomas had built them himself with his own hands. Years before he'd become wealthy enough to hire others to do such work. It was worth checking, at least. Over the next few days, Caleb made a point of working near each of the line shacks in turn, examining them carefully. The first 2 revealed nothing unusual, but the third, the one farthest north in the foothills, had something the others didn't, a stone fireplace Thomas had constructed with particular care. The stones were fitted so precisely that mortar was barely necessary. It was the kind of work a man did when he wanted something to last. Caleb studied the fireplace for a long time. Then he began testing the stones, pressing each one, checking for movement. Most were solid, but one stone, about waist-high on the right side, shifted slightly when he pushed it. He worked it loose carefully and reached into the space behind it. His fingers touched metal. Heart pounding, Caleb pulled out a metal box about the size of a large book. It was locked, but the lock was simple. The kind a man might use if he wanted to keep something safe from casual discovery, but needed to open it quickly himself. Caleb had learned to pick such locks during his scouting days. It took him only a few minutes to work it open. Inside were papers, letters, documents. Caleb's hands shook slightly as he lifted out the first item, a photograph in a tin frame. It showed a younger Thomas Hartwell standing beside a woman and a small girl. The woman was lovely, with dark hair and a gentle smile. The girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, had her father's eyes and her mother's smile. On the back of the frame, in Thomas's handwriting, "My family, my heart, my Sarah." Beneath the photograph were letters. Some were from Sarah to Thomas, written over the years in a child's careful hand that gradually matured into an elegant adult script. They spoke of school, of friends, of her mother's illness, of her life in Boston. And they spoke of love for a father she barely remembered but desperately wanted to know. Thomas's responses were there too, copies he'd kept of letters he'd sent to her. In them, Caleb could read a father's longing, his regret over the divorce, his desire to be part of his daughter's life. And in the most recent letters, written just months before his death, Thomas spoke of bringing Sarah home, of giving her what was rightfully hers, of making amends for all the years they'd lost. At the bottom of the box was a sealed envelope with Sarah's name written across it in Thomas's hand. Caleb didn't open it. It wasn't meant for him. But he could feel the weight of it, both physical and emotional. This was Thomas's final message to his daughter, perhaps written when he knew his time was short. Beneath that envelope was another document, a will dated just 2 weeks before Thomas's death. Caleb read it carefully, his jaw tightening with each line. Thomas had left everything to Sarah, the ranch, the house, the land, the cattle, every asset he owned. There was a provision for Eleanor, a generous cash settlement that would have kept her comfortable for life. But the bulk of the estate, the heart of everything Thomas had built, was meant for his daughter. The will was witnessed and notarized, legal binding, or it should have been. Caleb sat back on his heels, the document in his hands, and felt the full weight of what Eleanor had done. She'd murdered her husband. Caleb was certain of that now. She'd destroyed the will she could find, probably the one filed officially with the lawyer. But Thomas had been smart enough, or suspicious enough, to make a copy and hide it where Eleanor would never think to look. Now Caleb held that copy, and with it he held the power to destroy Eleanor's carefully constructed lies. But he also held Sarah's future in his hands, and that made him more careful than he might have been with his own fate. If he moved too quickly, if he confronted Eleanor directly, she might harm Sarah before justice could be served. He needed to be strategic. He needed a plan. He carefully returned everything to the strongbox except the copy of the will, which he folded and tucked inside his shirt. The rest, the letters, the photograph, he left in their hiding place. They were evidence, but they were also precious memories that belonged to Sarah. When the time was right, she should be the one to retrieve them. Caleb replaced the stone in the fireplace and made sure everything looked undisturbed. Then he sat on the rough wooden bunk in the line shack and thought through his options. He could go to the territorial authorities, but that would take weeks, and Eleanor's influence might reach even there. He could go to the local sheriff, but the man was in Eleanor's pocket. He could gather the townspeople and make a public accusation, but without a lawyer to present the case properly, Eleanor might simply dismiss it as a forgery. What he needed was an ally with legal knowledge and enough courage to stand against Eleanor's power. And the only person who fit that description was Mr. Brennan, the aging lawyer who'd helped Thomas draft his original will. The next morning, Caleb rode into town early, before the sun had fully cleared the mountains. He found Mr. Brennan's office above the land office, a small room with law books lining the walls and papers stacked on every surface. Brennan himself was a thin man in his late 60s, with white hair and sharp eyes that missed little. "Mr. Stone," Brennan said when Caleb knocked on his open door. "I was wondering when you'd find your way here. You were expecting me?" "Let's say I was hoping. Thomas Hartwell was my friend as well as my client. What happened after his death has troubled my conscience considerably." He gestured to a chair. "Sit. Tell me what you know." Caleb sat and laid out everything, Sarah's true identity, the suspicious circumstances of Thomas's death, Eleanor's cruelty, the strongbox, and finally, the copy of the will he'd found. He pulled out the document and placed it on Brennan's desk. The lawyer's hands trembled slightly as he picked it up and read through it. When he finished, he set it down carefully and removed his spectacles to rub his eyes. "I drafted this will myself. Thomas came to me 3 months ago and said he wanted to change his estate plan. He told me Sarah was coming home, and he wanted everything to go to her. He advised him to tell Eleanor, to prepare her, but he said she'd never accept it. He said she'd married him for his money, and she'd fight any attempt to disinherit her. So he kept it secret, he did. And he asked me to file the will with the county clerk and keep the original in my safe. I did both. But 2 days after Thomas died, Eleanor came to my office with a different will, one dated a week after the will I'd just filed. In that version, everything went to her, with only a small bequest to any surviving children. But Sarah's his only child, exactly. And the will was very carefully worded to make it seem like he'd acknowledged the possibility of children, but hadn't specifically named Sarah as his heir. Eleanor claimed Thomas had changed his mind after Sarah arrived and disappointed him somehow. She said he'd had a different lawyer draft the new will because he didn't want to hurt my feelings by undoing my work. And you believed her? Brennan's expression turned bitter. I didn't want to, but she had the will, properly witnessed and notarized. It was dated more recently than mine. And when I checked with the county clerk, the will I'd filed was missing, just gone. The clerk claimed there must have been a filing error, that it had never been properly recorded. Without that document, I had no proof my version was legitimate. Eleanor destroyed it, almost certainly, or had someone destroy it for her. The clerk was new, young, probably easy to bribe or intimidate. Brennan picked up the copy of the will again. But this changes everything. This is proof that Thomas intended Sarah to inherit. With this, we can challenge Eleanor's claim. What do we need to do? First, we need to get Sarah somewhere safe. If Eleanor realizes we have this document, she'll move against her immediately. Second, we need to gather more evidence of Eleanor's crimes, the poisoning, the fraud, the destruction of legal documents. Third, we need to present all of this to the territorial judge in a way that leaves no room for Eleanor to maneuver. Caleb leaned forward. I need to talk to Sarah. She has a letter from Thomas with his gold seal, proof of their relationship. But getting to her without Eleanor knowing won't be easy. I might be able to help with that. Brennan stood and moved to a cabinet in the corner of the room. He pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses, poured generous measures in both, and handed one to Caleb. Thomas used to say that doing the right thing was often the hardest thing. He was right about that. But he also said that hard things were usually worth doing. They drank in silence. 2 men preparing for a fight they weren't certain they could win. How long do you think we have before Eleanor makes her next move? Caleb asked. Not long. She's been quietly courting a rancher named Culver from the next territory. Rich, widowed, eager for a wife with property of her own. I've heard rumors they might marry before winter. If that happens, she'll have even more protection. A husband's word carries weight in court, and Culver's money and connections could make it nearly impossible to challenge her. Then we move soon. We move carefully, Brennan corrected. Eleanor has destroyed men who threatened her less than we're about to. But yes, we move soon. As Caleb left the lawyer's office, he felt the full weight of what he'd taken on. This wasn't just about helping one young woman reclaim her inheritance. It was about standing up to corruption and cruelty that had flourished, because good people had looked away. It was about making sure Thomas Hartwell's final wishes were honored. And it was about proving that justice still meant something, even in a place where money and power usually won. He rode back to the ranch with the copied will hidden in his saddlebag, his mind already working on how to reach Sarah, how to prepare her, how to get her to safety when the time came. Eleanor was watching him closely now. He'd seen Dutch following him again that morning. Any contact with Sarah would be risky. But as he reached the ranch and saw Sarah carrying water from the well, her head bowed under the weight of the buckets, he knew he had to find a way. She'd been waiting for months, enduring daily humiliation, holding on to hope that someone would see the truth. She deserved to know that someone finally had, that she wasn't alone anymore. That help was coming. That night, Caleb waited until the main house was dark and quiet. Then he made his way to the small shed where the ranch tools were kept, a building he knew Sarah passed every morning before dawn on her way to start the kitchen fires. He left a note tucked under a loose board where she'd find it, written in careful block letters. I know who you are. I found your father's will. Mr. Brennan is helping. Stay strong. Trust no one else. Burn this after reading. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, in the darkest times, a beginning was all you needed to find the strength to keep going. The days that followed were a careful dance of normal routines masking desperate preparation. Caleb worked his regular duties while quietly gathering information and building alliances. Eleanor maintained her iron control over the household, seemingly unaware that the ground beneath her feet was beginning to shift. A week after his conversation with Sarah, Caleb rode into Silver Ridge with a specific purpose. He needed to see the actual legal documents that Eleanor had used to claim the estate, the forged will she'd presented to Mr. Brennan. Understanding exactly what she'd created would help them counter it effectively. He found Mr. Brennan in his office, surrounded by law books and papers. The old lawyer looked up when Caleb entered, his expression grave. "I've been doing some research," Brennan said without preamble, "into the laws governing inheritance disputes in the territory. The situation is more complicated than I initially thought." Caleb sat down heavily. "How complicated?" Eleanor's will, the forged one, was properly filed and recorded. In the eyes of the law, it's legitimate until proven otherwise. To challenge it, we need to prove not just that Thomas wrote a different will, but that Eleanor knew about it and deliberately destroyed it. That's fraud, and potentially conspiracy to commit fraud. We know she destroyed it. The county clerk's records disappeared. Knowing and proving are different things. The clerk claims ignorance, says he never saw Thomas's will, that it was never properly filed. Without the original, and without someone willing to testify that Eleanor destroyed it, we're fighting an uphill battle. What about Sarah's testimony? She can tell the court what happened. She can try, but Eleanor will argue that Sarah is a disgruntled relation trying to steal an inheritance. Without corroboration, it becomes her word against Eleanor's, and Eleanor has the weight of property, wealth, and social standing on her side. Caleb felt frustration building. So what do we do? We need more evidence. Ideally, we need to prove the poisoning. If we can show that Eleanor murdered Thomas, everything else falls into place. The forged will becomes part of a larger pattern of criminal behavior. Brennan pulled out a document from a drawer. "I've been reviewing Doc Hayes's notes on Thomas's final illness. The symptoms are consistent with arsenic poisoning, but Hayes didn't test for it at the time. He had no reason to suspect foul play. Can we test now? Exhume the body? That requires a court order, which requires probable cause, which requires evidence we don't have yet. We're caught in a circular problem." Brennan rubbed his eyes tiredly. "But there might be another way. If Eleanor still has the poison, if we can find it and prove she possessed it around the time of Thomas's death, that could be enough to launch an investigation." "You want me to search her private rooms?" "I can't ask you to do that. If you're caught, Eleanor could have you arrested for burglary. Or worse." Caleb thought about Sarah's face when she talked about her 2 days with her father. The happiness that had been stolen from both of them. "I'll do it. When's our best chance?" "Eleanor hosts a dinner party next Wednesday evening. All the important people in the territory, the judge, the banker, several large ranchers, including Mr. Culver. She'll be occupied for hours, and the staff will be focused on the dining room and kitchen. That's your window. Sarah can help. She knows the house, knows Eleanor's routines. Be careful involving her further. If Eleanor suspects Sarah knows something, she might move against her immediately. Sarah's already involved, and she's stronger than Eleanor gives her credit for." Brennan nodded slowly. "Thomas always said his daughter had steel in her spine. I'm beginning to believe he was right." After leaving the lawyer's office, Caleb made several other stops in town. He visited Doc Hayes, who quietly agreed to help if they found evidence of poisoning. He stopped at the blacksmith shop, where Hank Morrison expressed his support, cautiously but sincerely, and he went to the general store, where Mr. Carlson whispered that other townspeople were beginning to question Eleanor's version of events. The seeds of doubt had been planted. Now they needed to grow into certainty. That evening, back at the ranch, Caleb found a moment alone with Sarah as she carried firewood to the main house. He fell into step beside her, his voice low. Wednesday night. Eleanor's dinner party. That's when we search her rooms. Sarah's step never faltered. I'll make sure I'm assigned to serve. I can create a distraction if needed. We're looking for poison. Probably a small bottle, something easily concealed. I'll search her private chambers. You watch for Dutch and the other hands. She paused at the porch steps. If we find nothing, then we present what we have and hope it's enough. But I think we'll find something. Eleanor's confident. Too confident. She believes she's untouchable. That kind of confidence makes people careless. Wednesday arrived with crisp autumn air and clear skies. Eleanor spent the day in a state of controlled excitement, overseeing every detail of the dinner preparations. She wore a new dress, ordered from San Francisco, deep emerald green that complemented her coloring. Her mahogany cane had been polished until it gleamed, and she carried it like a scepter. The guests began arriving at sunset. Caleb watched from the barn as carriages rolled up, the territorial judge and his wife, the bank president, several wealthy ranchers and their families, and finally, Mr. Culver himself. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, recently widowed, with the prosperous look of someone who'd never known real hardship. He greeted Eleanor with practiced charm, and she responded with a smile that almost looked genuine. As the dinner began, Caleb moved into position. The servants were busy in the kitchen and dining room, and the ranch hands had been given the evening off. Eleanor wanted no rough men around when she entertained refined company. Only Dutch remained, on duty, stationed near the front entrance like a guard dog. Sarah had told Caleb that Eleanor's private chambers were on the second floor, at the far end of the hallway. She kept the rooms locked when she wasn't using them. But Sarah had made a wax impression of the key weeks ago, hoping it might prove useful someday. Caleb had taken that impression to Hank Morrison, who'd created a duplicate. Now he stood in the shadows near the back stairs, the copied key heavy in his pocket, waiting for Sarah's signal. She appeared at the kitchen door carrying a tray of dishes. She looked at him once, nodded slightly, then went back inside. The distraction would come in 5 minutes. Caleb counted out the time, then moved up the back stairs quickly and quietly. Years of scouting had taught him how to move without sound, and he used every bit of that training now. The upstairs hallway was empty, lit by a few oil lamps that cast flickering shadows on the walls. Eleanor's door was at the end of the hall, solid oak with a brass lock. Caleb inserted the key, holding his breath, and felt it turn smoothly. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges, and he slipped inside, closing it behind him. The rooms were lavishly furnished. Eleanor had spared no expense in her personal quarters. A 4-poster bed dominated one room, with velvet curtains and silk pillows. A sitting area held delicate furniture that looked imported from Europe. A dressing room connected to the bedroom, filled with gowns and jewelry that represented more wealth than most people in Silver Ridge would see in a lifetime. Caleb moved quickly through the rooms, searching methodically. The bedside tables held only books and personal items. The wardrobe contained clothes and shoes. The bureau drawers were filled with undergarments and accessories, all carefully organized. He was beginning to think they'd been wrong when he noticed the writing desk in the corner of the sitting room. It was locked, but the lock was simple, easier even than the door had been. Inside, he found Eleanor's private correspondence, her account books, and a small wooden box with a brass clasp. The box was locked as well. Caleb worked at it for 30 seconds before it clicked open. Inside, wrapped in velvet cloth, was a small blue glass bottle. No label, no markings, but when Caleb carefully removed the stopper and sniffed, he detected the faint garlic-like odor that Doc Hayes had mentioned as characteristic of arsenic. His hands shook slightly as he rewrapped the bottle and placed it back in the box. This was it. This was the evidence they needed. Eleanor had kept the poison, probably because disposing of it might create more questions than keeping it hidden. Or perhaps she'd kept it because she planned to use it again, on Sarah perhaps, or on anyone else who threatened her position. Caleb carefully locked the box and returned everything to how he'd found it. He was turning to leave when he heard voices in the hallway. Eleanor's voice, sharp with irritation, and Mr. Culver's deeper tones trying to be soothing. "I simply need to retrieve my wrap," Eleanor was saying. "The dining room is drafty, and I won't sit there shivering while trying to conduct a civilized conversation." "Of course, my dear, though I must say you look quite lovely even when shivering." The voices were coming closer. Caleb looked around the room quickly, assessing his options. The windows opened onto a second-story drop. The wardrobe was too obvious. The only other option was the dressing room, with its racks of gowns and shelves of shoes. He moved quickly into the dressing room and pulled the door almost closed, leaving just a crack to see through. His heart pounded as he heard the key turn in the main door's lock. Eleanor entered, Mr. Culver following close behind. She moved to the wardrobe and pulled out a shawl, draping it over her shoulders. "There, that's better. Though I do wonder why servants can't seem to maintain proper fires in every room." You're quite exacting with your staff," Culver observed, his tone light but with an edge of something else. "Curiosity, perhaps, or mild disapproval. One must be, particularly with certain types. They require constant supervision, or they'll become lazy and presumptuous." Eleanor adjusted the shawl, then turned to face Culver with a calculated smile. "But surely we didn't come up here to discuss household management?" "No," Culver agreed, moving closer to her. "I came because I wanted a moment alone with you, away from all those eyes downstairs." "How bold of you, Mr. Culver. Whatever will people say?" "They'll say we're a man and woman of appropriate age and station, spending a moment together. Nothing scandalous in that, surely." Eleanor's smile widened. "I suppose not. Though I must admit, I'm surprised you're this eager. We've only been courting a few months, long enough for me to know what I want." "You're a remarkable woman, Eleanor. Beautiful, intelligent, capable of running a successful ranch on your own. Not many women could do what you've done. Not many women have had to." Eleanor's voice took on a practiced note of sadness. "When Thomas died, I had no choice but to learn quickly. This territory doesn't forgive weakness. Indeed it doesn't, which is why I believe our union makes perfect sense. My holdings combined with yours would create the largest ranch operation in 3 territories. We'd be a formidable partnership." "Partnership," Eleanor repeated, her tone thoughtful. "Is that how you see marriage? As a business arrangement?" "Every successful marriage has a foundation of practical considerations. Passion fades, beauty ages, but property and wealth endure." Culver took her hand. "I'm offering you security, Eleanor. Protection, a man's name to stand behind when the wolves circle. And in return, I gain a wife who understands the realities of frontier life." From his hiding place, Caleb watched Eleanor's face carefully. She was considering Culver's words, weighing them against her own plans. He could see the calculation in her eyes. "You speak very plainly," she said finally. "I appreciate that. I've had enough of romantic nonsense to last a lifetime." Thomas was full of poetry and grand gestures, but he was a fool in practical matters. He nearly gave away everything we'd built to... She stopped abruptly, catching herself. "To whom?" Culver asked, his interest clearly piqued. "To various charitable causes and dubious relations. But that's in the past now. I've secured the estate and it will remain secured." She squeezed his hand. "If we marry, as I expect we will, you'll find me a practical and profitable partner. But I need certain assurances." "Name them." "First, the estate remains in my name. I won't surrender control of what I've worked to maintain. Second, certain past matters remain buried and unexamined. I've had to make difficult decisions, and I won't apologize for them or have them questioned. And third," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "there's a young woman currently working as my maid. She's a problem that needs to be resolved before our wedding." Quietly and permanently, Caleb felt his blood run cold. She was planning Sarah's murder openly, discussing it like a business transaction. Culver frowned. "I'm not certain I understand what you're suggesting." "Don't you? I think you understand perfectly well. The girl is the last loose end from my previous marriage. She has certain ideas about her place in Thomas's life and his estate. Ideas that are completely unfounded but potentially troublesome. She needs to disappear before she can create problems for us. You're asking me to be complicit in murder. I'm asking you to be realistic. This territory is dangerous. Young women disappear all the time. Accidents happen. Wild animals falls from cliffs, drownings in rivers. The frontier claims many lives. Eleanor's voice was utterly calm, utterly cold. I'm simply suggesting that nature might take its course in the next few weeks. Before our wedding, preferably. Culver pulled his hand away from hers. I came here seeking a wife, Eleanor, not a partnership in crime. Crime? What a dramatic word. I'm speaking of practical problem solving. You said yourself that this territory doesn't forgive weakness. Well, allowing potential threats to persist would be weakness. I'm eliminating a threat, nothing more. The girl is a human being, not a threat to be eliminated. The girl is a nobody with delusions of grandeur. She came here trying to claim an inheritance she has no right to, and I won't allow her to destroy everything I've built. Eleanor's voice hardened. I thought you were a man who understood what success requires. Was I mistaken? Culver stared at her for a long moment, and Caleb could see the exact moment when the rancher's perception of Eleanor shifted from attractive widow to something far darker. I believe I was mistaken about you, Mrs. Hartwell. I apologize for wasting your time. He turned and walked toward the door. Eleanor's voice stopped him. If you leave now, if you speak a word of this to anyone, I'll destroy you. I have friends in every corner of this territory. Judges, bankers, politicians. I can make your life very difficult, Mr. Culver. I can tie up your land in legal disputes, call in your loans, spread rumors about your character. You'll find yourself isolated and broke within 6 months. Culver turned back, his expression a mixture of disgust and pity. I have friends as well, Mrs. Hartwell, and I have something you seem to lack, a conscience. Threaten me all you like. I'm leaving, and I'm done with this courtship. He left, closing the door behind him with controlled force. Eleanor stood alone in the room, her hands clenched at her sides, her face twisted with rage. Then, with visible effort, she composed herself, smoothing her expression and her skirts. She picked up her cane and struck it once against the floor, a gesture of frustrated anger, then followed Culver out of the room. Caleb waited in the dressing room for a full minute after she left, making sure she wouldn't return. His mind was racing. Culver had just heard Eleanor essentially confess to planning murder. That changed everything. They now had a witness, a wealthy, respected witness who had no reason to lie and every reason to want distance from Eleanor. But it also meant Eleanor was now desperate. She'd just lost her prospective husband and her plans for a quick marriage and sale of the estate. She'd be dangerous now, unpredictable. She might move against Sarah immediately, rather than waiting. He slipped out of the dressing room, checked the hallway, and made his way back down the stairs. He found Sarah in the kitchen, washing dishes alongside Rosa. Her eyes met his, questioning. He shook his head slightly. Not here, not now. She understood, and returned to her work. Caleb left through the back door and made his way to the barn. He needed to think, to plan. Everything was accelerating now. Culver would leave the dinner party, was probably leaving even now, and Eleanor would have to deal with the social humiliation of her suitor walking out. She'd also know that Culver might talk, might tell people what she'd said. She'd need to act quickly to discredit him, to paint him as a jilted suitor spreading lies. And she'd need to eliminate Sarah before anyone else could hear her story. Caleb was still thinking through the implications when Dutch found him in the barn. Mrs. Hartwell wants to see you, the foreman said, his expression suggesting he knew something had gone wrong. Right now. She's in the middle of a dinner party. Not anymore. Guests are leaving. Something happened with Mr. Culver. They had words and he stormed out. Dutch's smile was unpleasant. Mrs. Hartwell is in a mood. I'd advise you to step carefully. Caleb walked to the main house, with Dutch following close behind. The dining room was indeed clearing out, guests making hurried excuses and departing into the night. The judge and his wife looked uncomfortable. The banker and his family seemed confused. Whatever had happened between Eleanor and Culver, it had effectively ended the party. He found Eleanor in the study, standing behind Thomas's desk as she had before. But this time her composure was cracking at the edges. Her face was flushed, her breathing slightly elevated, her hands gripping the cane so hard her knuckles showed white. "Mr. Stone," she said, her voice tight, "I've been reconsidering your employment." "Yes, ma'am. You've been working here for several months now, long enough to observe the household, to see how things operate. Tell me, have you noticed anything unusual? Anyone acting suspiciously or inappropriately?" It was a trap, and not a subtle one. She was trying to determine what he knew, who he might have talked to. Caleb kept his expression neutral. "Can't say I have, ma'am. Mostly I'm out working the land. Don't see much of the house or the household, but you've interacted with the staff. With the girl, for instance, Sarah, only in passing. She brings water out to the work crews sometimes, that sort of thing. Has she ever spoken to you about personal matters? About her history or her situation here?" "No, ma'am. She mostly keeps to herself, I've noticed." "Does her work and stays quiet?" Eleanor studied him, clearly trying to determine if he was lying. "I ask because the girl has been spreading certain stories. Lies, really. Claims about her relationship to my late husband. It's disturbing and offensive, and I won't tolerate it. I haven't heard any stories, ma'am. If you do, I expect you to report them to me immediately. The girl is troubled, possibly even dangerous. She has delusions about her place here, and those delusions could lead her to harm herself or others." Eleanor's eyes were hard. "Do you understand what I'm saying, Mr. Stone? The girl is a threat. If something were to happen to her, an accident, a fall, a moment of carelessness, it would be tragic but not entirely surprising. She's not well. She's not stable. People would understand." Caleb felt his hands curl into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice level. "I understand what you're saying, Mrs. Hartwell. You're telling me you plan to hurt that girl, and you want me to look the other way when you do." The room went silent. Dutch took a step forward, but Eleanor raised her hand to stop him. "That's not what I said," she replied coldly. "You're putting words in my mouth. I'm simply expressing concern about a troubled young woman in my employ. As her employer, I have a responsibility to ensure she doesn't come to harm, the kind of harm you're planning to arrange. You're being insubordinate. Mr. Stone, I could have Dutch escort you off the property right now. You could try—" Caleb met her eyes steadily. "But I think we both know that would cause talk. People would wonder why you fired me so suddenly. They might start asking questions. And questions are the last thing you want right now, especially after your prospective husband walked out on you tonight." Eleanor's face went white, then red. "You know nothing about my personal affairs. I know you just lost your chance at a quick marriage and a profitable sale. I know you're desperate now, backed into a corner. And I know desperate people make mistakes." He took a step toward the desk. "Here's what's going to happen, Mrs. Hartwell. You're going to leave that girl alone. You're not going to hurt her, threaten her, or arrange any convenient accidents. Because if anything happens to her, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who was responsible. You have no proof of anything, don't I? I think if people started looking closely at your late husband's death, at the will that conveniently left everything to you, at the way you've treated his daughter, yes, his daughter. We both know that's who she is. They might find some interesting things." Eleanor's expression shifted through several emotions: shock, rage, and finally, calculation. "You've been busy, Mr. Stone. More busy than a simple ranch hand should be. I wonder what you think you've accomplished. I've accomplished enough. And if you're smart, you'll leave Silver Ridge, sell the ranch to someone legitimate, take your money, and go somewhere no one knows your history. That's your best option now. You're threatening me in my own house. I'm giving you advice. There's a difference." Caleb turned to leave, then paused at the door. "You made one mistake, Mrs. Hartwell. You underestimated everyone around you. You thought no one would notice, no one would care, no one would act. You were wrong." He walked out before she could respond, Dutch glaring after him but making no move to stop him. As Caleb crossed the yard toward his quarters, he saw Sarah watching from a window in the kitchen. He couldn't read her expression at this distance, but he hoped she understood what had just happened. The fight was out in the open now. No more hiding, no more careful planning. Eleanor knew they were coming for her, and she'd respond with everything she had. The next 3 weeks until the planned wedding date were going to be the most dangerous Sarah had ever faced. But at least now she wouldn't face them alone. The morning after the disastrous dinner party brought a cold rain that matched the mood at the Hartwell Ranch. Caleb woke before dawn to find Dutch and 2 other ranch hands stationed outside his quarters. They didn't speak, just watched with the kind of attention that made their message clear. He was being monitored. His movements restricted. Eleanor was making her move. Caleb went about his morning routine as if nothing had changed, but his mind was working through options and contingencies. His confrontation with Eleanor had forced her hand, but it had also protected Sarah in the short term. Eleanor couldn't harm the girl now without it being obvious who was responsible. But that protection was temporary. Eleanor would find a way. She always did. He was saddling his horse when the ranch foreman approached. "Mrs. Hartwell wants you working the south pasture today. Fence repair. Dutch will be going with you. Don't need help with fences," wasn't a suggestion. The foreman looked uncomfortable, like a man caught between orders he didn't agree with, and a paycheck he couldn't afford to lose. "Just do the work, Stone. Don't make trouble." So Eleanor was separating him from Sarah, making sure he couldn't interfere with whatever she had planned. Caleb considered refusing, forcing a confrontation right then. But that would accomplish nothing except getting him thrown off the property. Better to seem compliant while finding another way. He rode out to the south pasture, with Dutch trailing behind him like a shadow. The work was legitimate. There was fence damage from the summer storms, but it was also the farthest point from the main house. Far enough that he couldn't see what was happening there. Far enough that if Sarah called for help, he'd never hear it. The morning passed slowly. Caleb worked methodically, stretching posts and stringing wire, while Dutch sat on his horse and watched. Neither man spoke. The rain continued its steady drumming, turning the ground to mud and making every task twice as difficult. Around midday, another ranch hand rode out carrying food and coffee. He handed the basket to Dutch, then turned to Caleb with a careful expression. "Rosa sent extra," the hand said quietly. "Said you'd need your strength." He handed over a wrapped bundle that was heavier than it should have been. Inside the cloth, along with bread and meat, was a folded piece of paper. Caleb palmed it smoothly, tucking it into his shirt while Dutch's attention was on the coffee. The ranch hand rode away without another word. Caleb ate his meal slowly, watching Dutch from the corner of his eye. When the foreman's attention drifted, focused on the distant mountains, Caleb pulled out the note and read it quickly. Sarah's handwriting, small and precise. "Eleanor sent for the sheriff. Claims I stole jewelry. Plans to have me arrested and removed from property. She's moving tonight. Please help, S." Caleb's jaw tightened. It was clever. Eleanor couldn't kill Sarah openly now, but she could have her arrested on false charges and removed from the ranch. Once Sarah was in custody, isolated and without protection, arranging an accident would be much easier. A fall downstairs at the jail, a sudden illness, any number of tragedies could befall a young woman accused of theft. He needed to get back to the main house, but Dutch was watching him too closely, and the south pasture was hours from anywhere. By the time he rode back, the sheriff might already have taken Sarah, unless he created a reason to return. Caleb studied the fence line he'd been repairing, then the terrain beyond it. A steep slope led down to a creek, swollen with rain. The horses had to cross that creek to reach the water source on the other side. If something spooked them during the crossing, he worked for another hour, waiting for the right moment. It came when Dutch dismounted to check something on his saddle. Caleb stood up from the fence post he'd been setting and stumbled deliberately, catching his foot on the wire. He went down hard, crying out as if in pain, and clutched his ankle. Dutch hurried over, his expression more annoyed than concerned. "What happened?" "Twisted it. Caught my boot in the wire." Caleb tried to stand and deliberately collapsed again. "Can't put weight on it." Of all the... Dutch swore creatively. "Can you ride?" "Maybe, if someone helps me mount." Caleb made a show of trying to stand again, wincing convincingly. Years of playing wounded to draw out enemy scouts had taught him how to sell an injury. We should head back. I can't work like this. Dutch looked torn between suspicion and practicality. If Caleb was genuinely hurt, leaving him out here would be negligent. But if he was faking, bringing him back to the main house played into whatever plan he had. Finally, practical concerns won out. Fine, but if you're playing me, Stone, there'll be hell to pay. Just get me on my horse. The ride back took over an hour, with Caleb maintaining his active injury the entire way. By the time they reached the ranch, the afternoon was waning toward evening. He could see the sheriff's horse tied outside the main house, and his heart sank. They might already be too late. Dutch helped him dismount, and Caleb made his way toward his quarters, limping convincingly. But instead of going inside, he circled around toward the back of the main house, moving as quietly as he could. Dutch called after him, but Caleb ignored him, focusing on reaching the kitchen door. Rosa met him there, her face tight with worry. "They're in the study." The sheriff's questioning her now. Eleanor's accusing her of stealing a silver pocket watch, Mr. Thomas's watch that Eleanor wears on a chain. The watch. Of course, it would have Thomas's initials engraved on it, would be valuable, and its theft would be a serious crime. And Sarah would have no way to prove she hadn't taken it. "Where's the watch now?" Caleb asked. "Eleanor's wearing it. She showed it to the sheriff, said she discovered it missing this morning and found it in Sarah's room." Rosa's hands twisted in her apron. "It's all lies, Mr. Stone. That girl never stole nothing." "But who's going to believe her over Mrs. Hartwell?" Caleb moved through the kitchen and down the hallway toward the study. He could hear voices, Eleanor's, smooth and concerned, the sheriff's, gruff and official, and Sarah's quiet but steady. "I didn't take anything," Sarah was saying. "Mrs. Hartwell is lying." "That's a serious accusation, miss." The sheriff's voice held little sympathy. "Mrs. Hartwell is a respected member of this community. She's got no reason to lie about something like this. She has every reason. She's trying to get rid of me because I know the truth about her and my father." "Your father? What are you talking about?" "Thomas Hartwell was my father. This ranch should be mine. Eleanor poisoned him and forged his will to steal my inheritance." There was a moment of silence. Then Eleanor's voice filled with practiced sadness. "You see, Sheriff, this is what I've been dealing with. The poor girl is delusional. She's convinced herself she's Thomas's daughter, though of course she has no proof. I've tried to help her, given her employment and a place to stay, but she's grown increasingly unstable. When I confronted her about the missing watch, she became violent and threatening. I fear for my safety." "I never threatened you," Sarah said, her voice rising. "I never—" "That's enough." The sheriff's tone had shifted from neutral to decisive. "Miss, I'm going to have to take you into custody. If you're innocent, you'll have a chance to prove it at trial. But right now, Mrs. Hartwell has made a formal complaint, and I have a duty to investigate." Caleb stepped into the doorway of the study. All three occupants turned to look at him, Eleanor with barely concealed triumph, the sheriff with irritation, and Sarah with desperate hope. "Sheriff," Caleb said quietly, "before you take her anywhere, there's something you should know." "Mr. Stone," Eleanor said sharply, "this doesn't concern you. Leave immediately." "Can't do that, ma'am. See, I've got information relevant to this case. Information the sheriff needs to hear before he makes any arrests." The sheriff was a stocky man, in his 40s, named Patterson. He'd held his position for 5 years, largely because Eleanor and other wealthy landowners supported him. But he wasn't entirely corrupt, just cautious about crossing people with power. He looked at Caleb with wary interest. "What information?" "Sarah Hartwell, yes, Hartwell, that's her legal name, is Thomas Hartwell's daughter from his first marriage. She came west at her father's invitation 2 days before he died. Eleanor knew about her, knew Thomas had changed his will to leave the ranch to Sarah and poisoned Thomas to prevent that will from taking effect." Eleanor laughed, but it sounded forced. "This is ridiculous." "Sheriff, Mr. Stone has no proof of any of this. He's simply repeating the same delusions Sarah has been spreading." "I have proof," Caleb said. "Thomas Hartwell's original will, properly witnessed and notarized, naming Sarah as his primary heir. Letters between Thomas and Sarah documenting their relationship. A photograph of them together when Sarah was a child. "And I know where to find the poison Eleanor used to kill him." The sheriff's expression had changed from irritation to careful attention. "Those are serious allegations, Stone. You better be sure about this." "I'm sure. And I'm not the only one who knows. Mr. Brennan, the lawyer, has copies of the will. Doc Hayes can testify about the suspicious nature of Thomas's death. And Mr. Culver, the rancher who was courting Eleanor, heard her admit last night that she plans to have Sarah killed." "That's a lie," Eleanor said, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. "Culver and I had a disagreement. He's a jilted suitor making up stories." "Then let's ask him," Caleb said. "Let's bring everyone together and see who's telling the truth. Unless you're afraid of what they'll say." The sheriff looked between them, clearly trying to decide how to proceed. On one hand, he had Eleanor Hartwell, a wealthy widow who helped fund his campaigns. On the other, he had specific allegations of murder and fraud that, if true, would be the biggest case of his career. "All right," he said finally. "Here's what's going to happen. Miss Sarah, you're coming with me, but you're not under arrest yet. You're being held for questioning. Mrs. Hartwell, you're going to stay right here and not go anywhere until I've had a chance to investigate these claims. Mr. Stone, you're going to take me to this evidence you say you have. If it's real and it's legitimate, we'll proceed accordingly. If you're lying to protect a thief, you'll be arrested yourself." "Understood." "Understood," Caleb said. "Sheriff, you can't seriously be considering—" Eleanor began. "Ma'am, I'm considering everything, which is what I'm supposed to do. If this girl really did steal from you, she'll face justice. But if there's even a chance that what Mr. Stone is saying is true, I need to look into it. That's my job." Eleanor's face went pale, then flushed with rage, but she said nothing more, just stood there gripping her cane so hard Caleb thought it might snap. As the sheriff led Sarah out, she caught Caleb's eye. He gave her a slight nod. "Trust me." She nodded back, her chin high despite her fear. "Mr. Stone," the sheriff said, "show me this evidence." Caleb led him out of the house, aware of Dutch and the other ranch hands, watching from various positions around the property. Word would spread quickly that the sheriff was investigating Eleanor. Some would be pleased. Others would be afraid for their jobs. They rode to the Northline shack, the sheriff following in watchful silence. When they arrived, Caleb dismounted and led the way inside to the stone fireplace. He worked the loose stone free and pulled out the metal box. Thomas Hartwell hid this here. It contains everything: his will, letters, photographs. Everything that proves Sarah is his daughter and his rightful heir. The sheriff took the box and opened it carefully. He spent a long time examining the contents, reading the will, studying the photograph, going through the letters. When he finally looked up, his expression was grim. "This is real," he said quietly. "This is Thomas Hartwell's handwriting. I've seen it enough times on legal documents to know. And this will is properly executed and witnessed. Eleanor destroyed the copy filed with the county, probably bribed the clerk to claim it was never recorded. She presented a different will, one that left everything to her, forged or coerced. Thomas was dying when it was supposedly signed. Eleanor could have forced him or simply created it after his death and backdated it." The sheriff was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "You mentioned poison. Where is it?" "In Eleanor's private chambers. A blue glass bottle hidden in a wooden box in her writing desk." "You searched her rooms?" "I did. And before you ask if that makes the evidence inadmissible, remember that we're in territorial court, not federal. Rules are different here, and sometimes you have to break small rules to expose big crimes." Patterson almost smiled. "You sound like someone who's thought about this." "I've had time to think. 3 weeks of watching that woman torture an innocent girl tends to focus the mind." "All right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to ride back, and I'm going to search Eleanor's rooms with her present. If I find that poison, she's under arrest. If I don't, then we move to the next step, getting a proper investigation launched through the territorial governor's office." "And Sarah?" Sarah stays in protective custody until this is resolved, but not in a cell. I'll arrange for her to stay with my wife. Eleanor won't be able to get to her there. Relief flooded through Caleb. Thank you, Sheriff. Don't thank me yet. This isn't over. Eleanor Hartwell has powerful friends. Even if we prove everything, she might find a way to escape real consequences. He closed the metal box carefully. But at least now we're asking the right questions. And sometimes that's where justice begins. They rode back to the ranch as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. It was beautiful, but Caleb barely noticed. His mind was on what came next, the search, the arrest, the trial that would follow, and on Sarah, who'd waited so long for someone to believe her, to fight for her, to help her reclaim what was rightfully hers. The wait was almost over, but the hardest part was still ahead. The search of Eleanor's chambers yielded exactly what Caleb had promised. The small blue glass bottle wrapped in velvet cloth, hidden in the locked box in her writing desk. Sheriff Patterson held it up to the lamplight, his expression grave. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said quietly, "can you explain why you have arsenic in your private rooms?" Eleanor stood in the doorway, her face a mask of composure that must have cost her dearly to maintain. "That bottle isn't mine. I've never seen it before. Someone must have planted it there. Who would do that? Mr. Stone, obviously. He admitted to searching my rooms. He could have placed it there himself to support his ridiculous accusations. Except I didn't know he was searching your rooms until after he found it," Patterson pointed out. "And the box was locked. How would he have gotten into it?" "I don't know. But I do know that bottle doesn't belong to me." Patterson turned to Caleb. "When did you search these rooms?" "Last night, during the dinner party." "The bottle was already there. Can anyone corroborate that?" Caleb hesitated. He didn't want to implicate Sarah further. But before he could answer, a voice came from behind them. "I can." They all turned to find Mr. Culver standing in the hallway, his expression set and determined. Eleanor went pale. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "I came back to speak with Sheriff Patterson, to tell him what I heard last night in these very rooms." Culver stepped forward, his bulk somehow reassuring. "Mrs. Hartwell, you told me last night that you planned to eliminate a young woman in your employ. You discussed it as casually as you might discuss purchasing cattle. When I expressed my horror and refused to be part of it, you threatened to destroy me financially and socially." "That's not," Eleanor began. But Culver cut her off. "I'm a wealthy man, Mrs. Hartwell, wealthy enough that your threats don't frighten me. And I'm a man who believes in doing what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. What you described last night was murder, premeditated, calculated murder. And I won't stand by and let it happen." Sheriff Patterson looked at Culver with new respect. "You're willing to testify to this?" "I am. I'll swear to it in any court you choose." Eleanor's composure finally cracked. "You fool. You have no idea what you've done. I have friends, powerful friends. The territorial judge, the bank president, half the legislature. They'll destroy you for this." "Let them try," Culver said calmly. "I've faced down drought, disease, hostile tribes, and economic collapse. I'm not afraid of corrupt officials." Patterson set the bottle down carefully on Eleanor's writing desk. "Eleanor Hartwell, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Thomas Hartwell, for fraud in the matter of his will, and for conspiracy to commit murder against Sarah Hartwell. You have the right to—" "Wait," Eleanor said, her voice sharp. "You're making a terrible mistake. If you arrest me, if you pursue this investigation, things will come out. Things that will hurt more than just me." "What things?" Patterson asked, Eleanor's eyes fixed on Caleb. "Ask Mr. Stone about his past. Ask him what he did during the war. Ask him why he really came to Silver Ridge." Caleb felt his stomach drop. He'd known his past might surface eventually, but he hadn't expected Eleanor to weaponize it now. "What's she talking about?" Patterson asked, turning to Caleb. "Nothing relevant to this case," Caleb said carefully. "Oh, but it is relevant." Eleanor's smile was vicious now. "Tell them, Mr. Stone, tell them about the Shoshone village. Tell them what you and your cavalry unit did there in 1864. The room went silent. Caleb felt every eye on him, felt the weight of memories he'd spent years trying to bury rising up to choke him. I was a cavalry scout during the war, he said quietly. I followed orders. Some of those orders were wrong. I've spent the last 10 years trying to make peace with that. The trial was set for 3 weeks later in the territorial courthouse that served Silver Ridge and the surrounding counties. Those 3 weeks felt like both an eternity and an instant. Filled with frantic preparation and gnawing anxiety, Eleanor had indeed been released on bail. Her lawyer, an expensive man from Denver named Harrison Blake, had argued successfully that she was a respected member of the community with no history of violence and no reason to flee. The judge, the same one who'd attended Eleanor's dinner parties, had agreed. The bail was set high, but Eleanor paid it without hesitation. She returned to the Hartwell ranch as if nothing had changed, moving through the house with her mahogany cane clicking against the floors, issuing orders to a staff that now watched her with wary eyes. But something had changed, fundamentally and irrevocably. People were talking, questions were being asked, and Eleanor's armor of respectability had developed cracks that no amount of money or social standing could fully repair. Sarah remained with Sheriff Patterson and his wife, a kind woman named Martha who treated her like the daughter she'd never had. The Pattersons' home was modest but warm, and for the first time in months, Sarah slept without fear of being awakened by Eleanor's cane tapping outside her door or Dutch's heavy footsteps in the hallway. Caleb visited when he could, always accompanied by Mr. Brennan to maintain propriety. They worked on Sarah's testimony, preparing her for the questions she'd face, the accusations Eleanor's lawyer would make, the scrutiny she'd endure. He'll try to make you seem like a fraud, Brennan explained one afternoon, the three of them sitting in the Pattersons' parlor. He'll question every detail of your story, looking for inconsistencies. He'll suggest you're a confidence artist who researched Thomas's past and came here to steal an inheritance. But the letters, Sarah protested. The photograph, my father's will. How can they dismiss all that? They won't dismiss it outright. They'll cast doubt on it. Suggest the letters were forged, that the will was created after Thomas's death, that the photograph could be of anyone. Brennan's expression was grave. We have the truth on our side, but truth isn't always enough. We need to present it clearly, persuasively, and without any openings for doubt. What about the poison? Caleb asked. Eleanor had arsenic in her possession. That's not something an innocent person typically keeps hidden in a locked box. Blake will argue it was planted. He'll point to your illegal search of her rooms and suggest you manufactured evidence. He's already petitioned to have the poison excluded from evidence on those grounds. Will the judge allow that? I don't know. Judge Carmichael has ties to Eleanor, but he also has a reputation to maintain. If he appears too biased, it could hurt him politically. We'll have to wait and see. The days passed in a blur of preparation. Mr. Culver gave his deposition, describing in detail the conversation he'd overheard between Eleanor and himself. Doc Hayes reviewed his notes on Thomas's final illness and agreed to testify about the symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning. Hank Morrison, the blacksmith, confirmed Thomas had commissioned a strongbox shortly before his death. Mr. Carlson from the general store testified about Thomas, buying special writing paper with gold seals, but for every witness who stepped forward to support Sarah's case, Eleanor's lawyer found two who spoke to her good character and community standing. The bank president praised her business acumen. The president of the Ladies' Aid Society described her charitable work. A dozen ranch hands and business associates testified that she'd run the Hartwell estate efficiently and fairly after Thomas's death. It was a battle of narratives, and Eleanor had spent years building hers. Sarah was starting from nothing, asking people to believe that the widow they'd all known and respected was actually a murderer and a fraud. A week before the trial, Caleb received an unexpected visitor at the ranch. He'd been working near the barn when a well-dressed stranger approached on horseback, a man in his 30s with an Eastern manner and expensive clothes. "Mr. Stone?" the man called. "I'm looking for Caleb Stone." "That's me," the man dismounted and extended his hand. "James Mitchell. I'm a reporter for the Denver Post. I've been following the Hartwell case, and I'd like to ask you some questions." Caleb shook his hand warily. Not sure I have much to say to reporters. I understand your reluctance. But this case has attracted attention beyond Silver Ridge. A wealthy widow accused of murdering her husband and stealing his daughter's inheritance. It's the kind of story people want to read about. And I'd rather tell it accurately than rely on speculation and rumor. What do you want to know? Everything. How you came to be involved, what evidence you found, why you believe Sarah Hartwell's claims. Mitchell pulled out a notebook. And I'd like to hear your side of what happened during the war. Mrs. Hartwell's lawyer has been circulating information about your military record. I'd like to give you a chance to respond. So Eleanor was using the press to attack his credibility before the trial even began. Caleb should have expected that. I was part of an incident during the war that I'm not proud of. I've never denied it. When I realized what was happening, I tried to stop it and save lives. That's all I have to say about it. That's not quite all, though, is it? Mitchell's voice was gentle but persistent. You testified against your commanding officer. That took courage. Most men would have stayed silent to protect their careers and their reputations. Most men didn't watch children die because they followed orders without question. Mitchell wrote quickly in his notebook. And now you're standing up for Sarah Hartwell, even though it's cost you your position and potentially your safety. Some might see a pattern there, a man trying to redeem past failures by fighting for justice now. I'm not looking for redemption, Caleb said flatly. I'm looking to help a young woman who's been victimized by someone with power and money. That's all? Fair enough. Mitchell closed his notebook. For what it's worth, I believe Sarah's story. I've done my research, talked to people who knew Thomas Hartwell, looked at the timeline of events. Everything points to Eleanor being guilty, but belief and proof are different things. The question is whether the jury will see what I see. What do you think our chances are? Honestly, better than they were a week ago. Public opinion is shifting. People are asking questions they should have asked when Thomas died. Eleanor's still powerful, but she's not untouchable anymore. If the trial goes well, if the evidence is presented effectively, you might win. Mitchell paused. But it's not going to be easy. Eleanor's lawyer is very good, and Judge Carmichael owes her favors. You'll need everything to go right. After Mitchell left, Caleb found himself thinking about chance and fate and the strange paths life takes. A year ago, he'd been living alone in the mountains, avoiding human complications, seeking peace in isolation. Now he was at the center of a legal battle that would determine not just Sarah's future, but his own sense of who he was and what he stood for. The evening before the trial, Mr. Brennan called a final meeting at his office. Caleb, Sarah, Doc Hayes, Mr. Culver, and several other key witnesses gathered in the cramped space, reviewing their testimonies one last time. Remember, Brennan said, looking at each of them in turn, Blake will try to rattle you, to make you angry or defensive. Don't give him that satisfaction. Answer his questions calmly and honestly. If you don't know something, say so. If you're not certain about a detail, admit it. Credibility is everything in a courtroom. Sarah sat quietly through most of the meeting, her hands folded in her lap, the wooden cross her father had made visible at her throat. She'd worn it every day since Caleb had given it back to her, a tangible connection to the man she'd barely had time to know. Sarah, Brennan said gently, how are you holding up? I'm scared, she admitted. Eleanor's lawyer is going to try to destroy me on that stand. He's going to paint me as a liar and a fraud. And part of me wonders, what if the jury believes him? What if they decide I'm just some opportunist trying to steal what isn't mine? Then we'll have lost the legal battle, but not the moral one, Caleb said quietly. Because we'll know the truth, and so will you. That's not much comfort. No, he agreed. But sometimes it's all we have. I've learned that the hard way. After the others left, Caleb walked Sarah back to the Pattersons' house. The night was cool and clear, with stars scattered across the sky like silver coins. They walked in comfortable silence for most of the way, but as they neared the house, Sarah stopped and turned to face him. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said, I want you to know how grateful I am. You didn't have to help me. You could have stayed out of it, minded your own business, kept your head down. But you didn't. You stood up for me when no one else would. That means more than I can express. Your father was a good man. He deserved better than what Eleanor gave him. And you deserved better than being treated like you were nothing. Caleb met her eyes. I've done things I'm ashamed of, Sarah, things I can't undo or make right. But helping you, standing up for what's right this time, that's something I can do. Something I needed to do, for my own sake as much as yours. Because of what happened during the war. Yes, and because I've spent too many years watching injustice happen and doing nothing. I couldn't do it again. Not this time. Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand briefly. Thank you, Caleb, for seeing me, for believing me, for fighting for me. Thank you for trusting me. She went inside, and Caleb stood on the street for a moment longer, looking up at the stars and thinking about tomorrow. The trial would determine so much. Not just who owned the Hartwell ranch, but whether justice could prevail against wealth and power. Whether truth could overcome carefully constructed lies. Whether a system designed to protect the rich and influential could also protect someone like Sarah, who had nothing but the truth on her side. He walked back to his boarding house. He'd moved off the ranch after Eleanor's release and found sleep difficult to come by. His mind kept turning over testimony and evidence, looking for weaknesses Eleanor's lawyer might exploit, ways their case could fall apart. Around midnight, he gave up trying to sleep and went for a walk through the quiet streets of Silver Ridge. The town looked peaceful in the moonlight, almost innocent. But Caleb knew better now. He'd seen what lay beneath the surface, the compromises people made, the injustices they tolerated, the way they looked away from cruelty because confronting it was uncomfortable or dangerous. He found himself at the cemetery on the edge of town, standing before Thomas Hartwell's grave. Someone had been tending it. Fresh flowers sat in a jar beside the headstone, and the grass around the plot was neatly trimmed. Sarah, probably, paying her respects to the father she'd barely known. I hope we're doing right by you, Caleb said quietly to the grave. I hope this is what you would have wanted. The stone offered no answer, of course. But standing there in the silence, Caleb felt a sense of purpose settle over him. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever the outcome of the trial, he would know he'd done everything in his power to honor Thomas's wishes and protect his daughter. That would have to be enough. The morning of the trial dawned bright and clear. Caleb dressed carefully in the one good suit he owned, purchased years ago for occasions that never seemed to arrive. He met Mr. Brennan outside the courthouse at 8 o'clock, an hour before proceedings were set to begin. Already a crowd had gathered. News of the trial had spread throughout the territory, drawing spectators from miles around. James Mitchell stood near the courthouse steps, notebook in hand, observing everything. Other reporters had come too, from Denver and Colorado Springs, and as far as Santa Fe. Quite a circus, Brennan observed dryly. Will that help or hurt us? Depends on the outcome. If we win, public attention will make it harder for Eleanor to appeal or manipulate the verdict. If we lose, it will be a very public defeat. Sarah arrived with Mrs. Patterson, looking pale but composed. She wore a simple but elegant dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her make, and her dark hair was pulled back neatly. She looked like what she was, a respectable young woman, educated and refined. Nothing like the downtrodden servant Eleanor had tried to make her. Eleanor arrived in her carriage at 8:30, accompanied by her lawyer Harrison Blake. She was dressed in black silk, the widow's weeds she'd worn since Thomas's death, playing the role of grieving wife one last time. Her mahogany cane gleamed in the morning sun, and she carried herself with absolute confidence. When Eleanor's eyes met Sarah's across the courthouse steps, her expression remained neutral. But Caleb saw something flicker there, hatred perhaps, or fear that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse. All rise for the Honorable Judge William Carmichael. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled and people standing along the walls. Caleb sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, where Mr. Brennan had arranged their documents and evidence. Sarah sat beside Brennan, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm, despite what must be churning inside her. Judge Carmichael entered, a heavy-set man in his 60s with white hair and sharp eyes. He'd presided over Silver Ridge's court for 15 years, and his reputation was mixed. Some said he was fair. Others said he favored those who could afford to influence him. Today would reveal which assessment was accurate. This court is now in session, Carmichael said, settling into his chair. We are here to consider criminal charges against Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, murder in the first degree of her late husband, Thomas Hartwell, fraud in the matter of his will and estate, and conspiracy to commit murder against Miss Sarah Hartwell. How does the defendant plead? Harrison Blake stood, smooth and confident. Not guilty on all counts, Your Honor. Very well, Mr. Brennan, you may present your opening statement. Brennan rose, and Caleb noticed his hands were steady despite the pressure. The old lawyer looked at the jury. 12 men from Silver Ridge and the surrounding area. Farmers and shopkeepers and ranch hands who would decide Sarah's fate, and began to speak. Gentlemen of the jury, this case is about 3 things: greed, murder, and the theft of a daughter's inheritance. Thomas Hartwell was a good man who built a successful ranch through honest work. When he died 6 months ago, supposedly of natural causes, his widow Eleanor inherited everything. Or so it appeared. Brennan paused, letting his words sink in. But the truth is far darker. Thomas Hartwell was murdered, poisoned by his wife with arsenic because he had changed his will to leave his estate to his daughter, Sarah. Eleanor destroyed the legitimate will, forged a new one, leaving everything to herself, and then forced Sarah into servitude to keep her silent. He gestured to the evidence table. We will prove all of this through documents, through testimony, and through the testimony of Sarah herself. We will show you that Eleanor Hartwell is not the grieving widow she pretends to be. She is a murderer and a fraud who will do anything to maintain her stolen wealth and power. And we will ask you to render the only verdict that justice demands, guilty on all counts. Brennan sat down. Harrison Blake immediately stood for his opening statement. Gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying easily through the courtroom. What Mr. Brennan has just described is a fascinating story. But that's all it is, a story, a narrative constructed by a young woman who came to Silver Ridge with nothing and saw an opportunity to claim an inheritance she has no right to. Yes, Sarah claims to be Thomas Hartwell's daughter, but where is the proof? A few letters that could have been forged, a photograph that could be of anyone, the word of a mountain man with a violent past and a guilty conscience. Blake moved to stand directly in front of the jury. The prosecution wants you to believe that Eleanor Hartwell, a respected member of this community, murdered her husband in cold blood. But they have no proof, no witness to the alleged poisoning, no confession, no evidence beyond circumstantial claims and illegal searches. What they have is conjecture, speculation, and the testimony of people with their own reasons to lie. He returned to his table. We will show you that Eleanor Hartwell is innocent, that Thomas died of natural causes, attended by his doctor, that his will was legitimate and properly executed, that Sarah is an opportunist who saw a chance to steal a fortune and took it. And we will ask you to see through this elaborate fraud and render the only just verdict, not guilty. Both sides had drawn their battle lines. Now came the hard part, proving their cases through testimony and evidence, fighting for every point, every concession, every moment of doubt or certainty in the jury's minds. Mr. Brennan, Judge Carmichael said, call your first witness. The prosecution calls Miss Sarah Hartwell to the stand. Sarah stood, smoothed her dress, and walked to the witness stand with her head high. She was sworn in, her voice steady as she promised to tell the truth. And then she sat and faced the courtroom full of strangers who would judge whether she was a victim or a fraud. Caleb found himself holding his breath. Everything depended on this moment, on whether Sarah could tell her story convincingly, on whether the jury would see the truth in her words, on whether justice would prevail or wealth and power would triumph once again. The trial had begun, and in the next few hours, Sarah Hartwell's entire future would be decided. We're losing, Sarah said quietly. I can see it in the jury's faces. They don't believe me. They're uncertain, Brennan corrected. That's different from disbelief. We still have witnesses to call tomorrow, including you, Mr. Stone. Your testimony about finding the will and the poison could be decisive. Blake will tear me apart, Caleb said. He'll bring up my past, paint me as a violent man with a guilty conscience trying to redeem himself through false heroics. Let him, Brennan said. Tell the truth about your past, own it. Show the jury you're not hiding anything. That kind of honesty can be powerful. The next morning, Caleb took the stand. He was sworn in and sat facing the crowded courtroom, aware of every eye on him. Brennan led him through his testimony, how he'd come to work at the Hartwell Ranch, what he'd observed regarding Eleanor's treatment of Sarah, the investigation he'd conducted finding the strongbox, discovering the poison. Why did you involve yourself in this matter? Brennan asked. You were just a hired hand. You could have kept your head down and stayed out of it. Caleb took a breath. I spent too much of my life looking away from injustice. I watched a young woman being abused and humiliated, and I couldn't ignore it. When I learned the truth, that she was Thomas Hartwell's daughter and Eleanor had stolen her inheritance, I had to act. Some things are worth standing up for. Thank you, Mr. Stone. Brennan sat down, and Harrison Blake rose. Mr. Stone, Blake began, his voice friendly. You mentioned looking away from injustice in the past. Let's talk about that. You served in the cavalry during the war, correct? I did. And you were present at an incident involving a Shoshone village in 1864. I was. Please describe what happened. Caleb met Blake's eyes steadily. My unit received orders to attack a village believed to be harboring hostile warriors. When we arrived, we found mostly women, children, and elderly people. Some of the men under my command, against orders from some officers but encouraged by others, began killing indiscriminately. I tried to stop it. I pulled 3 children from a burning lodge and got them to safety. After the attack, I testified against the commanding officer responsible. The testimony ended my military career, but you were there when the killing started. You were part of the initial attack. I was following orders I believed to be legitimate. When I realized what was really happening, I acted to stop it. How many people died in that attack, Mr. Stone? Too many. More than 40, mostly women and children. Blake let that number hang in the air. And now you're here, asking this jury to believe you're a man of conscience and integrity. But you have blood on your hands, don't you? I do, Caleb said quietly. I carry it every day, and that's exactly why I couldn't look away from what was happening to Sarah. I've spent 10 years trying to atone for one terrible day. Standing up for her, that's part of that. Atonement. Or you're a man with a violent past trying to manipulate this court through false testimony and manufactured evidence. No, everything I've said is true. Is it? You admit to illegally searching Eleanor Hartwell's private chambers. You admit to taking documents from her property without permission. You admit to conspiring with Sarah Hartwell to build a case against Eleanor. Why should this jury believe anything you say? Because I have no reason to lie. I'm not asking for money or property or recognition. I'm asking for justice for a young woman who deserves it and for a good man who was murdered by his wife. Blake smiled. Or you're asking this court to believe an elaborate fantasy created by a fraud and supported by a man desperate to ease his guilty conscience. Believe what you want, Caleb said. But the evidence is real. The will is real. The poison is real. And Sarah Hartwell is Thomas Hartwell's daughter. Whether you want to accept it or not, we'll let the jury decide that. Blake returned to his seat. No further questions. The afternoon brought Eleanor's testimony. She took the stand dressed in black, her expression one of dignified sorrow. Blake led her through her version of events, how she'd married Thomas out of love, how she'd managed the ranch after his death, how Sarah had appeared with wild claims and forged documents. Mrs. Hartwell, Blake said gently, did you poison your husband? Of course not. I loved Thomas. His death devastated me. Did you forge his will? No. The will presented to the court is legitimate. Thomas signed it of his own free will. The poison found in your chambers. Can you explain it? I can't. I'd never seen that bottle before. Someone must have planted it there, probably Mr. Stone when he illegally searched my rooms. What about Sarah's claims that she's Thomas's daughter? Eleanor's expression grew sad. I believe Sarah genuinely believes she's Thomas's daughter. But Thomas told me his daughter died years ago back east. This young woman has fabricated documents and created an identity based on research and lies. I actually feel sorry for her. She must be very troubled to go to such lengths. It was a masterful performance. Eleanor appeared reasonable, sympathetic, and believable. When Brennan rose to cross-examine her, the task seemed nearly impossible. Mrs. Hartwell, Brennan began, you say you loved your husband. Did you know he'd changed his will to leave his estate to Sarah? He never changed his will. The will I presented is the only legitimate one. Mr. Culver testified that he overheard you discussing plans to eliminate Sarah. How do you explain that? Mr. Culver misunderstood a frustrated conversation about a difficult employee. He interpreted metaphor as literal threat because he was angry about our failed courtship. The servants at the ranch testified about your cruel treatment of Sarah. Were they all lying? They misinterpreted firm management as cruelty. I ran a household the way any woman of my station would. Thomas Hartwell's symptoms before death were consistent with arsenic poisoning. Isn't it true you poisoned him? No, Thomas died of natural causes. The doctor was there. He saw everything. Brennan tried for another hour to break through Eleanor's carefully constructed defenses, but she had an answer for everything. She was too practiced, too prepared. By the time she left the stand, Caleb could see doubt in the jury's faces again. The final day of the trial brought closing arguments. Brennan spoke passionately about justice and truth, about a daughter's right to her inheritance, about the pattern of evidence that pointed to Eleanor's guilt. Blake countered with reasonable doubt, with questions about Sarah's identity, with alternative explanations for every piece of evidence. Judge Carmichael instructed the jury on the law, on the burden of proof, on how to evaluate testimony and evidence. Then the 12 men filed out to deliberate. The wait was excruciating. Hours passed. Caleb sat with Sarah and Mr. Brennan in a small room adjacent to the courthouse, saying little, each lost in their own thoughts. Sarah fingered the wooden cross at her throat, her lips moving in silent prayer. Brennan reviewed his notes compulsively, as if he might find some argument he'd missed, some point that could tip the scales. Finally, after nearly 5 hours, word came. The jury had reached a verdict. They filed back into the courtroom, their faces carefully neutral. Caleb tried to read something in their expressions, but found nothing. Sarah sat beside him, her hand gripping his so tightly he could feel her pulse racing. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Carmichael asked. The foreman, a middle-aged farmer named Henderson, stood. We have, Your Honor. What say you? Henderson looked at Eleanor, then at Sarah. The moment stretched out, endless and terrible. Then he spoke. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Eleanor Hartwell, guilty. The courtroom erupted. Sarah gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth. Eleanor went white, then red, her composure finally shattering completely. Blake was on his feet immediately, objecting, demanding a new trial. Order. Carmichael's gavel cracked down. I will have order in this court. On the charge of fraud, Henderson continued when the room quieted, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. Sarah was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. Caleb found his own eyes wet and didn't care who saw. Eleanor Hartwell, Judge Carmichael said, his voice heavy with the weight of what came next. You have been found guilty on all charges by a jury of your peers. I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment in the territorial prison. You will be taken into custody immediately and transported under guard. May God have mercy on your soul. Eleanor stood, and for a moment Caleb thought she might collapse. But she gathered herself one final time, drew herself up to her full height, and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. This isn't over. I have friends, connections, resources. I will appeal. I will fight this. And when I'm free, and I will be free, every person who testified against me will regret it. Take her away, Carmichael said wearily. As the deputies led Eleanor from the courtroom, She looked back once at Sarah. The hatred in her eyes was pure and undiluted. But there was something else there too, defeat. The knowledge that her careful plans had crumbled, that her power had been stripped away, that she'd lost everything she'd fought so ruthlessly to keep. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. News of the verdict spread quickly, and the reaction was mixed, some cheering, others muttering darkly about the conviction. But most people simply looked relieved that the ordeal was over. James Mitchell approached Caleb with his notebook. "Mr. Stone, do you have a statement for the press?" "Justice was served today," Caleb said simply. "A good man's wishes were honored, and his daughter reclaimed what was rightfully hers. That's all that matters. What will you do now?" Caleb looked at Sarah, who stood surrounded by well-wishers. "I expect I'll help Miss Hartwell get settled on her ranch. Beyond that," he shrugged, "I haven't thought that far ahead. One more question. Do you feel redeemed now, after what happened during the war?" Caleb considered that. Redemption isn't something you achieve in a single moment. It's something you work toward every day, through every choice you make. Today was one choice. Tomorrow there'll be another. That's how it works. He walked away before Mitchell could ask anything else, moving through the crowd towards Sarah. She saw him coming and smiled through her tears. "We won," she said. "Caleb, we actually won." "You won," he corrected gently. "You stood up, told your truth, and the jury believed you. I couldn't have done it without you. Maybe, but you did it. That's what matters." Mr. Brennan joined them, looking exhausted but satisfied. "Miss Hartwell, we need to discuss the estate transfer. There are legal procedures to follow, documents to file, but the Hartwell ranch is yours now. Your father's will has been validated by this verdict." Sarah nodded, still dazed. "I understand. Thank you, Mr. Brennan, for everything." As the sun set over Silver Ridge, casting long shadows across the courthouse square, Caleb felt something shift inside him. Not redemption exactly, not peace, but perhaps the beginning of both. He'd stood up when it mattered. He'd fought for justice against wealth and power, and he'd won. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. For now it was enough. 3 months passed. Autumn settled over the territory in shades of gold and red, and the first snows dusted the high peaks where Caleb had once lived in isolation. But he wasn't in the mountains now. He was at the Hartwell Ranch, helping Sarah transform it from the place of pain it had been into something that honored her father's memory. The changes were both practical and symbolic. Sarah had kept Rosa and Mrs. Chen on staff, giving them raises and treating them with the respect Eleanor never had. She'd let Dutch and several other hands go, replacing them with workers who understood that fairness and decency mattered more than fear. She'd opened the ranch books to public audit, showing that she had nothing to hide. And she'd established a fund to help other women in difficult situations, a living memorial to the months she'd spent as Eleanor's prisoner. The mahogany cane that had been Eleanor's, symbol of power, sat in a corner of the barn now, gathering dust. Sarah had considered burning it, but decided instead to let it fade into irrelevance. Some things deserved to be forgotten rather than destroyed. On a clear October morning, Caleb found Sarah at her father's grave. She'd been coming here often, sometimes talking to Thomas about her decisions, sometimes just sitting in silence. Today, she was kneeling beside the headstone, placing fresh flowers in the jar she kept there. "I've been thinking," she said as Caleb approached, "about what comes next. For the ranch, for everything. The ranch is running well. The legal matters are settled. Eleanor's appeals have been denied. She'll spend the rest of her life in prison. I've done everything I set out to do." She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "So, now I'm wondering what I'm supposed to do with the rest of my life." Caleb leaned against the fence surrounding the small cemetery plot. "Your father built something good here. You could keep building on it. Make it even better, I know. And I will." But she paused, searching for words. "I spent so long fighting just to survive, just to reclaim what was mine, that I didn't think much about what would come after. Now that I have it, now that I've won, I feel a bit lost. That's natural. You've been focused on one goal for months. Now you need to find new ones." Sarah smiled slightly. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "Maybe I am. I spent 10 years in the mountains, telling myself I was seeking peace. But really I was just hiding. It wasn't until I had something to fight for, someone to fight for, that I felt like I was actually living again. And now, what will you do? It was the question Caleb had been asking himself for weeks. His work at the ranch was essentially complete. Sarah had offered him the foreman position permanently, with good pay and a place to stay. It was more stability than he'd had in years. But something in him still felt restless, unfinished. I don't know yet, he admitted. Part of me wants to go back to the mountains. But I'm not sure that's where I belong anymore. You belong here, Sarah said quietly. If you want to. This ranch, it's as much yours now as mine. You fought for it, bled for it in your own way. Father would have wanted you to stay. And so do I. Caleb met her eyes and saw something there that made his chest tighten. Not just gratitude or friendship, but something deeper. Something that had been growing between them through all the danger and struggle. Something neither of them had had time to examine or name. Sarah, he began. I know what you're going to say, she interrupted gently. That you're too old for me, or too damaged, or that it wouldn't be proper. But I don't care about any of that. I care that you're the only person who saw me when everyone else looked through me. That you stood up for me when it would have been easier to walk away. That you're a good man, trying to do better, and that's worth more than a perfect past. I'm not a good man. Not entirely. None of us are entirely anything. We're all just doing the best we can with what we've been given. She took a step closer. Stay, Caleb. Not because you owe me anything, or because you're still trying to atone for the past. Stay because you want to. Because you're building something here too. A future. A life. Caleb looked past her at the ranch, the house his friend Thomas had built, the land that stretched to the mountains, the life that was taking shape here. Then he looked back at Sarah, at this remarkable young woman who'd endured so much and come through it with her strength intact. I'll stay, he said. For as long as you'll have me. Sarah's smile was like sunrise. Then we'll make something good here. Something my father would be proud of. They walked back to the ranch house together, talking about plans for the winter, about improvements they wanted to make, about the life they were building. Around them, the land lay peaceful in the autumn light, free at last from the shadow Eleanor had cast over it. That evening, as the sun set behind the western mountains, Sarah and Caleb sat on the porch of the main house. Rhoda brought out coffee and fresh bread, then left them alone, with knowing looks and a satisfied smile. Some things didn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. Tell me about your father, Caleb said. The real stories, the ones that matter. I never got to know him, but I'd like to understand the man who built all this. So Sarah told him. Stories about Thomas's early days in the territory, about building the ranch from nothing, about his first wife and their brief happiness before things fell apart. She told him about the letters Thomas had written over the years, about his regrets and his hopes, about his determination to do right by his daughter, even when miles and circumstances kept them apart. He was a good man who made mistakes, Sarah concluded. He married Eleanor, thinking she'd be a proper partner for a ranch wife, and he didn't see the darkness in her until it was too late. But even then, even when he realized what she was, he tried to make things right. He changed his will. He called me home. He made plans to give me what should have been mine all along. He died before he could see it through, but he tried. That's what matters. He'd be proud of you, Caleb said. Of how you fought, how you survived, how you honored his wishes. I hope so. Sarah looked out at the land her father had loved. Sometimes I feel him here, you know. Like he's watching, making sure I'm taking care of the place properly. Making sure I'm happy. Are you happy, I mean? Sarah considered the question seriously. I'm getting there. For so long I was just focused on survival and justice. Now I have both, and I'm learning what comes after. Building a life, not just fighting for one. It's harder than I expected, but it's good. And having you here makes it easier. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and stars began to appear overhead. The same stars Thomas had looked at while building his dreams. The same stars that had witnessed both the cruelty of Eleanor's reign and the justice that had finally ended it. In the distance, a coyote called. Caleb had heard that sound countless times in the mountains, had found it lonely and haunting. But here, sitting beside Sarah with the warm glow of lamplight behind them and the promise of tomorrow ahead, the sound seemed different. Not lonely, but free, wild and alive and full of possibility. "You know what Father used to say?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. "He said the West was a place for second chances, for people who'd made mistakes elsewhere and wanted to start fresh. He believed everyone deserved that opportunity to be judged by what they do now, not what they did before. Wise man, he was. And he was right. You proved that. You came here carrying guilt from the war, trying to hide from your past. But when it mattered, when someone needed help, you stood up. You became the man you wanted to be instead of the man you'd been. I'm still working on that. We all are. That's what life is, constantly working to be better than we were yesterday." She turned to look at him directly. "And you are better, Caleb. You're a good man. Let yourself believe that." Caleb wanted to argue, to list all the reasons he didn't deserve her faith or her regard. But he found he couldn't, because maybe she was right. Maybe redemption wasn't a destination you reached, but a direction you traveled. Maybe it was enough to keep trying, keep choosing better, keep standing up for what was right. "I'll try," he said finally. "That's all I can promise. That's all anyone can promise." The weeks that followed settled into a comfortable rhythm. Caleb took on more responsibilities at the ranch, working alongside the hands during the day and spending evenings with Sarah, talking through decisions and plans. They developed an easy partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. The townspeople of Silver Ridge, who had watched the trial with fascination, now watched this development with approval. Some whispered about propriety and appropriate mourning periods, but most saw what was obvious. Two people who'd been through darkness together were building something good. In the light, Mr. Brennan stopped by one afternoon with papers for Sarah to sign, final legal documents transferring full ownership of the estate. He stayed for dinner, regaling them with stories about other cases he'd handled over the years, carefully avoiding any mention of Eleanor or the trial. "You've done well with this place," he told Sarah as he prepared to leave. "Thomas would be pleased. He always said the land would flourish under the right care. He meant you even back then. He knew you had the strength for it." After he left, Sarah stood at the window, looking out at the ranch that was now fully, legally, undeniably hers. The Hartwell Ranch, passed from father to daughter, as it should have been from the beginning. "It's strange," she said. "I fought so hard for this. And now that I have it, it feels both exactly right and completely surreal." Caleb came to stand beside her. "That's because it's real now. Not just a dream or a goal, but actual life. Real and solid and yours." "Ours," she corrected gently. "This place is ours, Caleb, if you'll accept it." He looked at her. This strong, brave woman who'd survived cruelty and fought for justice, and still found room in her heart for kindness. "I accept," he said, "on one condition." "What's that?" "That we hang a new sign at the entrance. Something that honors your father but looks forward to the future." Sarah smiled. "What did you have in mind?" "The Hartwell Ranch," he said. "Established 1853, rebuilt 1873. "Rebuilt," Sarah repeated, trying out the word. "Yes, I like that. Because that's what we're doing, isn't it? Not just continuing what Father built, but rebuilding it into something new, something better, something honest," Caleb added. "A place where people are judged by their character, not their social standing. Where hard work and decency matter more than money or power. A place my father would recognize," Sarah finished, "even if it looks different than when he left it." They commissioned the new sign from Hank Morrison, who crafted it with care and pride. When they hung it at the entrance to the ranch a week later, half the town turned out to witness the moment. It was, in its way, a celebration, not just of Sarah's victory in court, but of justice served, of truth prevailing, of the possibility that people could be more than their worst moments. As winter approached and the first real snows began to fall, Sarah and Caleb stood together on the porch one evening, watching the white blanket cover the land. The ranch was ready for winter, stock gathered, hay stored, buildings weatherproofed. They'd done good work, all of them, preparing for the hard months ahead. Do you ever think about her? Sarah asked quietly. Eleanor? Sometimes, Caleb admitted. I wonder if she regrets what she did. If prison has changed her at all. Mr. Brennan says she's still fighting her appeals, still claiming she's innocent, that we framed her. Some people never admit the truth, even to themselves. I almost feel sorry for her, Sarah said. She had so much wealth, position, a life most people would envy, and she threw it all away for greed and cruelty. What a waste! The waste was Thomas's death. Eleanor's imprisonment is justice, I know, but I can't help thinking about all the years she'll spend in that cell, knowing she destroyed her own life. Sarah shook her head. I don't want to end up like that, so focused on winning, on having, on controlling, that I forget what actually matters. You won't, Caleb said with certainty. You're nothing like her. You fought for what was yours by right, not to steal what belonged to someone else. There's a difference. They stood in silence for a while, watching the snowfall. Then Sarah spoke again, her voice soft but determined. I want to make this ranch a place of healing, not just for me, but for others. People who've been hurt, who need a fresh start, who deserve a second chance, like Father believed in, like you needed when you came down from the mountains. That's a good dream. Will you help me make it real? Caleb looked at her, at the hope and determination in her eyes, and felt something in his chest loosen, a burden he'd carried for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it. Not redemption, not yet, but forgiveness, perhaps. Of himself, of his past, of all the things he couldn't change. Yes, he said. I'll help you. For as long as you want me here. Sarah took his hand, her fingers cold from the winter air, but her grip warm and sure. Then we'll build something together, something good and lasting, something worthy of my father's memory. They stood together on the porch as darkness fell and snow continued to blanket the land. Behind them, the ranch house glowed with lamplight and warmth. Ahead of them, the future stretched out uncertain but full of possibility. In the mountains, Caleb had sought peace and found only isolation. Here, standing beside Sarah, with the weight of the past slowly lifting from his shoulders, he was beginning to understand that peace wasn't something you found in solitude. It was something you built with others, through shared struggle and mutual respect, and the daily choice to stand for what was right. The West was indeed a place for second chances. Thomas Hartwell had believed that, and he'd been right. Caleb had come here carrying the weight of old sins, and through helping Sarah reclaim her inheritance, he'd begun to find a way forward. Not forgetting the past, but no longer letting it define every step. As stars emerged between the falling snow, Caleb thought about Thomas Hartwell lying beneath his headstone on the hill, about the good man whose death had started all this. He hoped Thomas could see them now, see his daughter strong and free, see the ranch continuing in hands that would honor it. And he hoped Thomas would approve of the mountain man who'd stayed to help, who'd found in this fight something he'd been seeking for 10 years without knowing it. Not redemption or forgiveness from others, but the chance to be part of something bigger than his own guilt and regret. A life lived in service to justice and truth and simple human decency. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.